In the unfathomable depths of galactic history, long before the rise of humanity, before the Eldar reached their zenith, and countless millennia before the Emperor walked on Terra, the galaxy was a vastly different realm. This ancient epoch, known in fragmentary records as the War in Heaven, would cause events that continue to shape the galaxy in the 41st millennium. At the heart of this cosmic saga were two species whose conflict would forever alter the fabric of reality itself: the Old Ones and the Necrontyr. The Old Ones emerged as one of the first truly sentient species in the Milky Way, evolving to sapience when most of the galaxy remained primordial. Physically, they resembled tall, bipedal reptilians with elongated craniums housing their extraordinarily developed brains. Their skin possessed a scaled, leathery texture that shifted colors subtly with their moods and intentions. Though accounts vary, most sources describe them as standing nearly 3 meters in height, with slender limbs and digits capable of manipulating objects with remarkable precision. What truly distinguished the Old Ones was their innate and profound connection to the warp. Unlike later species who would struggle to comprehend and harness the immaterium, the Old Ones evolved alongside it, understanding its currents and tides as naturally as primitive species might understand the weather. This symbiotic relationship with the warp granted them lifespans measured not in centuries but in millennia. Death, for the Old Ones, came only through violence or conscious choice, never through the slow decay of time. The Old Ones' mastery of the warp manifested most significantly in their creation of the webway, a labyrinthine dimension existing between real space and the warp. This network of tunnels and chambers allowed instantaneous travel across vast distances without exposing travelers to the raw dangers of warp transit. The webway's construction represented perhaps the greatest technological achievement in galactic history, crafted through a combination of advanced material science and psychic engineering beyond the comprehension of later species. Their technology defied conventional understanding, blending material science with psychic manipulation in ways that appeared indistinguishable from magic to less advanced observers. They created living machines, psychically reactive materials, and devices that could manipulate the fundamental forces of reality. Their cities were grown rather than built, emerging from planetary crusts as vast, organic-seeming structures that pulsed with psychic energy and adapted to the needs of their inhabitants. As their civilization expanded across the stars, the Old Ones encountered numerous primitive species. Rather than conquering or destroying these emerging civilizations, they frequently assumed the role of mentors and guides. Their approach to these younger races varied. Sometimes they merely observed, other times they subtly directed evolutionary paths, and occasionally they actively intervened to accelerate development. This pattern of stewardship would eventually include species like the Eldar and the Krork, though these creations lay far in the future from the time of their first stellar expansion. While the Old Ones spread their benevolent influence across one region of the galaxy, a very different species was emerging on a harsh, radiation-blasted world circling an unstable star. This world, whose true name has been lost to time, but is often called Necrontyr Prime in Imperial texts, orbited a violently active star in a system near the galactic core. The planet's surface was constantly bombarded with deadly radiation, creating an environment where life struggled to take hold, much less thrive. Against all odds, life did emerge on this hostile world, eventually evolving into the humanoid species known as the Necrontyr. Their bodies were ill-suited to their environment, with cellular structures highly vulnerable to the radiation that saturated their homeworld. The average Necrontyr lived a brief, pain-filled existence, rarely exceeding 40 years. Their skin was thin, pallid, and prone to cancerous growths. Their organs frequently failed, and genetic deformities were commonplace. Physical pain was such a constant companion that Necrontyr medicine focused more on pain management than on curing the underlying conditions that plagued them. This biological suffering shaped Necrontyr psychology and culture in profound ways. They developed an obsession with death, permanence, and legacy. Their architecture emphasized durability and timelessness. Massive stone monuments and vast tomb complexes dominated their cities. Necrontyr art depicted scenes of suffering, transcendence, and immortality, often rendered in materials chosen specifically for their resistance to decay. Their writing system used pictograms carved into metal or stone, designed to withstand the ravages of time far beyond the lifespan of any individual. Family dynasties formed the backbone of Necrontyr society, with genealogical records maintained with fanatical precision. Since individual lives were so brief, continuity through bloodlines became paramount. A complex system of inherited titles, responsibilities, and feuds developed, with some dynastic conflicts spanning hundreds of generations. These dynasties competed fiercely for resources, territory, and status, though they would unite against external threats when necessary. Despite the harshness of their existence, or perhaps because of it, the Necrontyr achieved remarkable technological advancement. They developed sophisticated metallurgy, energy systems, and propulsion technologies that eventually allowed them to leave their punishing homeworld and establish colonies on more hospitable planets within their system. Their first interstellar ships were slow by later standards, but represented a monumental achievement for a species whose individual members rarely lived long enough to see major projects completed. As the Necrontyr expanded beyond their home system, they established a growing interstellar empire governed by a complex political structure. At its apex stood the Triarch, a ruling council of 3 pharaohs who guided the empire's expansion and mediated disputes between the increasingly powerful dynasties. The Triarch maintained cohesion in an empire fragmented by distance and dynastic rivalries, establishing a code of laws and traditions that all Necrontyr were expected to honor. Among the members of the Triarch, one figure emerged as particularly significant, Zarek, who would later be known as the Silent King. Even in these early days, Zarek demonstrated political acumen and strategic vision that set him apart from his peers. He recognized that the fractious nature of Necrontyr society threatened their survival and worked to strengthen central authority while carefully balancing the ambitions of the various dynasties. Under his guidance, the Necrontyr expanded their territory and technological capabilities at an accelerated pace. Zarek implemented a system where dynasties could compete for glory and resources through controlled conflicts and achievements rather than open warfare. He established grand construction projects that spanned multiple star systems, redirecting the Necrontyr's competitive nature toward collective advancement. These projects included vast stellar engineering works, planet-sized monuments, and the development of technologies that could extend their painfully short lives, if only by a few precious years. Despite these achievements, the fundamental problem of the Necrontyr's brief, painful existence remained unsolved. Their best medical technologies could only marginally extend their lifespans or temporarily alleviate their suffering. The radiation damage encoded in their very genetic structure proved resistant to all attempts at permanent correction. This biological limitation became an increasing source of bitterness as their empire expanded and encountered other species in the galaxy. The defining moment in Necrontyr history came when their exploratory vessels encountered evidence of the Old One's civilization. Initial observations revealed a species that appeared to live in perfect health for thousands of years, a concept almost incomprehensible to the short-lived Necrontyr. Further investigation confirmed what must have seemed an unbearable truth. The Old Ones had mastered biological immortality, the very thing that had eluded the Necrontyr despite centuries of desperate research. The discovery triggered a profound psychological crisis throughout Necrontyr society. Their entire civilization, built around coping with inevitable early death, was confronted with proof that such suffering was not a universal constant, but merely their particular curse. Records from this period show a sharp increase in civil unrest, religious fanaticism, and even suicidal behavior among the general population. The dynasties, previously locked in their own conflicts, began to unite in their resentment of the Old Ones. Zarek, recognizing both the danger and opportunity this discovery presented, sent diplomatic missions to the Old Ones. These emissaries carried a simple request: would the ancient species share their secrets of longevity with the suffering Necrontyr? The exact nature of the Old Ones' response has been lost to history, but the outcome is clear: they refused. Whether they declined due to principle, practicality, or simple indifference remains unknown, but their rejection sealed the fate of both civilizations. Some accounts suggest the Old Ones recognized something dangerous in Necrontyr psychology, a bitterness and capacity for hatred that might make immortality a dangerous gift to bestow upon them. Others indicate that the Old Ones simply determined that the Necrontyr's physiology was incompatible with their life extension techniques, which relied heavily on innate psychic potential that the Necrontyr notably lacked. Whatever their reasoning, the Old Ones' refusal was received as the ultimate insult by the Necrontyr leadership. Zarek returned to his people with news of the rejection, but rather than allowing this to fracture his empire, he channeled the collective outrage into a unifying force. For the first time in their history, the quarrelsome dynasties found themselves united by a common enemy. The resentment that had been simmering since the discovery of the Old Ones' longevity crystallized into outright hatred. Public rhetoric shifted dramatically, with the Old Ones portrayed not as potential saviors, but as selfish hoarders of immortality who had deemed the Necrontyr unworthy of their gifts. This period saw a significant militarization of Necrontyr society. Resources previously dedicated to tomb construction and life extension research were diverted to weapons development and shipbuilding. The dynasties competed to contribute to the war effort, developing increasingly deadly technologies to deploy against their new enemy. The Necrontyr, masters of material science and energy manipulation, created weapons capable of destroying planets and disrupting the very fabric of space-time. As preparations for war intensified, the Necrontyr studied their intended targets with methodical precision. They observed the Old Ones' settlements, mapped their webway routes where possible, and analyzed their psychic technologies for potential weaknesses. They recognized that despite their technological advancements, they faced an enemy with vastly greater experience and capabilities. The Old Ones' mastery of the warp gave them advantages in transportation, communication, and certain forms of warfare that the Necrontyr couldn't match. This strategic disadvantage led the Necrontyr to search for allies or assets that might help level the playing field. Their attention turned to unusual phenomena they had observed during their stellar explorations, entities that appeared to exist within stars themselves. These beings, composed of living energy and possessing intelligence far beyond mortal comprehension, would soon play a pivotal role in the conflict to come. The Necrontyr named these entities the Katan, or star gods, and their discovery would alter the course of galactic history in ways that even the forward-thinking Zarek could not have predicted. As the 60th millennium before Imperial reckoning drew to a close, the galaxy stood on the precipice of a conflict unlike any it had seen before or would see again. The Old Ones, ancient and powerful, remained largely unaware of the threat gathering against them. The Necrontyr, bitter and determined, prepared to unleash a war born of envy and existential rage. Encircling distant stars, the Katan watched with alien curiosity as mortal beings prepared to draw them into a war that would reshape the very foundations of reality. The Necrontyr's quest for vengeance against the Old Ones led them to discoveries that would forever alter the fabric of the galaxy. As their scientists and explorers ventured deeper into the mysteries of the cosmos, they began detecting unusual energy patterns within certain stars, phenomena that defied conventional understanding. These anomalies were not random fluctuations or stellar physics. They displayed patterns suggesting intelligence and purpose. The Necrontyr had unwittingly detected the first evidence of entities that would later be known as the Katan, or star gods. The Katan existed as vast, sentient energy constructs that inhabited the coronas of stars, feeding on the solar energies and stellar matter. Their native form was incomprehensible to material beings, clouds of conscious energy spanning thousands of kilometers, pulsing with power beyond mortal reckoning. These beings had existed since the birth of the galaxy itself, perhaps even earlier, evolving alongside the stars they inhabited. Unlike the Old Ones who had mastered the immaterium, the Katan were creatures purely of the materium, with no presence or even awareness of the warp. Their consciousness was utterly alien to biological life. The Katan perceived time differently, with individual thoughts potentially spanning centuries. They communicated among themselves through modulated solar flares and gravitational pulses, a language as incomprehensible to the Necrontyr as the deepest ocean currents would be to desert creatures. For countless eons, the Catan had remained in their stellar domains, unaware or unconcerned with the biological life evolving on the planets orbiting their homes. The Necrontyr's detection of these entities marked the beginning of what their scientists termed the Stellar Observation Protocol. Special observatories were constructed near stars showing signs of Catan presence, equipped with advanced sensors and energy manipulation devices. For decades, the Necrontyr studied these phenomena, gradually establishing patterns and developing theories about the nature of these star-dwelling intelligences. What began as scientific curiosity soon transformed into something more calculating as the Triarch recognized potential military applications. Zarek, the Silent King, took particular interest in these discoveries. The Necrontyr had long worshipped stars. Both the life-giving and death-dealing aspects of their home star had shaped their religion for millennia. The discovery of actual intelligences dwelling within stars seemed to validate ancient Necrontyr myths about star gods and cosmic entities. Zarek recognized that such beings, if they could be communicated with or controlled, might provide the advantage needed against the old ones. The breakthrough came when Necrontyr scientists developed a method to communicate with these stellar entities. Using precisely calibrated energy emissions, they created patterns that mimicked the Catan's own communication methods. The first successful contact occurred in a red giant star near the edge of Necrontyr space. The entity responded to the signals, adjusting its own energy patterns to establish a primitive form of dialogue. The Necrontyr were communicating with a god. These early communications were limited and abstract, focusing on mathematical concepts and energy patterns rather than language as biological beings understood it. The Catan, for their part, displayed curiosity about these tiny material beings that had somehow managed to reach out to them. They had never before encountered intelligent life that could perceive their existence, let alone attempt communication. This mutual curiosity formed the foundation of what would become a catastrophic relationship. As communications advanced, the Necrontyr learned that the Catan, despite their immense power, had limitations. They were bound to their stellar forms, unable to directly interact with or fully perceive the material universe beyond their solar domains. They could sense the broad strokes of galactic events through gravitational waves and electromagnetic radiation, but the details of biological civilizations remained beyond their comprehension. This limitation fascinated the Necrontyr scientists, who began theoretical work on how these entities might be granted greater interaction with the physical world. The solution came in the form of necrodermis, or living metal. This remarkable substance, developed through centuries of Necrontyr metallurgical research, possessed unique properties that allowed it to respond to specific energy patterns and take on virtually any physical configuration. Originally created for advanced construction and medical applications, necrodermis could be programmed at the atomic level to change shape, repair damage, and channel energy with unprecedented efficiency. Necrontyr scientists theorized that necrodermis could serve as a physical interface for the Catan, a body that could contain a portion of their stellar essence and allow them to experience the material universe directly. The proposal was presented to the Catan through their established communication methods, along with detailed explanations of what such bodies would allow them to experience. The concept of direct interaction with the material universe intrigued the Catan, who had never known existence beyond their stellar prisons. The first extraction and embodiment of a Catan was an undertaking of staggering complexity. A massive necrodermis vessel was constructed and positioned within the corona of a star, harboring one of the more responsive Catan entities. Specialized energy fields were generated to draw a portion of the Catan's essence into the waiting necrodermis shell. The process took months, with numerous failures and adjustments, but eventually succeeded. A fragment of a star god now existed in physical form, contained within a body of living metal. This first embodied Catan took the name Mephitron, though it would later become known throughout the galaxy as the Deceiver. Its necrodermis form was humanoid but distinctly alien, a golden-skinned figure standing 4 meters tall with elongated limbs and a face that shifted subtly between expressions. The Deceiver's movements were unnaturally fluid, as though it were still partly energy rather than solid matter. When it spoke, its voice resonated with harmonics that triggered emotional responses in biological listeners, a trait it quickly learned to manipulate. The deceiver displayed an immediate and intense fascination with material existence. It explored its new senses with childlike wonder, but processed information with godlike intelligence. Within days of embodiment, it had mastered spoken Necrontyr language and begun studying their culture, technology, and biology. The Necrontyr scientists were astonished by its rapid adaptation and intellectual capacity. Here was a being that could potentially solve problems that had eluded them for generations, including perhaps their own mortality. Following this success, a second Catan was embodied using refined techniques. This entity, far larger and more powerful than Mephitron, took the name Azagorod, though history would remember it as the Nightbringer. Unlike the Deceiver's golden, almost beautiful form, the Nightbringer manifested as a towering obsidian figure wrapped in tattered darkness, with a skull-like face and scythe-like talons. Where the Deceiver inspired awe and fascination, the Nightbringer triggered primal terror in all who beheld it, a reaction it seemed to relish. The Nightbringer's temperament differed markedly from the Deceiver's. Where Mephitron was curious and subtle, Azagorod was direct and overtly malevolent. It showed little interest in Necrontyr culture beyond their concepts of death and warfare. The scientists and dignitaries who worked with the Nightbringer reported disturbing dreams and waking hallucinations after prolonged exposure to its presence. Some committed suicide, leaving notes describing unbearable visions of cosmic darkness and universal extinction. Despite these concerning signs, the embodiment program accelerated. The Triarch, seeing the potential these beings offered against the Old Ones, authorized the creation of more necrodermis bodies and the contacting of additional stellar entities. Over the following decades, dozens of Catan were given physical form, each with unique aspects and personalities. Some took names from Necrontyr mythology, while others created identities entirely new to material existence. The Necrontyr built temples and laboratory complexes to house their new allies, treating them with reverence befitting gods while simultaneously studying them with scientific precision. The Catan, for their part, revealed technological concepts far beyond even the advanced understanding of the Necrontyr. They described methods of manipulating fundamental forces that had never occurred to material scientists, ways of harnessing energy that seemed to violate established physical laws, and materials with properties that should have been impossible. With the guidance of the Catan, particularly the Deceiver and the Nightbringer, Necrontyr technology advanced at an unprecedented rate. New weapons capable of stripping matter apart at the atomic level were developed. Vessels that could traverse interstellar distances in days rather than years were constructed. Defense systems that could withstand the Old One's psychic attacks were implemented across key Necrontyr worlds. The balance of power was shifting. However, this technological renaissance came at a price the Necrontyr did not initially recognize. The embodied Catan, while seemingly cooperative, harbored motivations entirely their own. Their native existence as stellar energy beings had provided a form of nourishment that their necrodermis bodies could not replicate. They required new sustenance, and they soon discovered that the energy released when living beings died, particularly sentient beings, provided exquisite nourishment. The first indication of this dark hunger came when Necrontyr workers at a Catan temple complex began disappearing. Investigation revealed that the resident Catan had been consuming them, not merely killing them, but somehow absorbing the energy released at the moment of death. When confronted, the Catan was unapologetic, explaining that such consumption was simply necessary for its continued existence in material form. The matter was reported to the Triarch, who made a fateful decision. The loss of some Necrontyr lives was an acceptable cost for the power the Catan offered against the Old Ones. This tacit permission marked a turning point. The Catan became more open about their feeding habits, though they primarily targeted lower caste Necrontyr and prisoners. The Deceiver, more politically astute than its brethren, suggested that dedicated feeding populations be established, Necrontyr who were specifically bred and maintained to nourish the Catan. The Triarch approved this measure, beginning a system of institutionalized sacrifice that would have horrified earlier generations of Necrontyr. As the Katan fed, they grew stronger and more independent. They began to move beyond the role of advisors and allies, subtly positioning themselves as the true power behind the Necrontyr Empire. The Deceiver was particularly effective at this, using its unmatched manipulative abilities to influence key dynasty leaders and even members of the Triarch. It whispered different promises to different factions, always encouraging courses of action that increased Katan influence. The Nightbringer took a more direct approach. It demanded worship and sacrifice, positioning itself as a death deity that the already death-obsessed Necrontyr found easy to accommodate. Cults dedicated to the Nightbringer spread across Necrontyr worlds, practicing elaborate rituals of sacrifice and self-mutilation. The entity fed gloriously on this devotion, growing in power and malevolence with each ceremony conducted in its name. Other Katan developed their own methods of control and consumption. Some posed as benevolent teacher gods, others as wrathful destroyers, and some as distant observers who demanded tribute for their continued protection. Regardless of their approach, all served their own interests first, viewing the Necrontyr as tools and food rather than allies or equals. Only Zarek, the Silent King, seemed to recognize the growing threat the Katan posed. His position allowed him to observe patterns across the Empire that individual dynasty lords missed. He noted the increasing influence of Katan advisors in political decisions, the growing acceptance of sacrifice as a normal part of Necrontyr life, and the subtle changes in cultural values that were making the Necrontyr more compliant to Katan demands. Yet even Zarek felt powerless to reverse course. The Katan were too integrated into Necrontyr society and too essential to their war plans against the Old Ones. The Katan, particularly the Deceiver, sensed Zarek's concerns and moved to neutralize them. In private audiences, Mephitron presented the Silent King with visions of victory against the Old Ones and solutions to the Necrontyr's age-old mortality problem. It spoke of a process that could transfer Necrontyr consciousness into undying necrodermis bodies similar to those the Katan themselves wore. Immortality, the very thing the Old Ones had denied them, could be theirs through Katan beneficence. The promise of immortality dangled before the Necrontyr was intoxicating. After millennia of suffering under their degenerative flesh, the prospect of eternal life in bodies of living metal seemed like salvation rather than subjugation. The Deceiver, most cunning of the Katan, presented biotransference, or the apotheosis, as it was grandly termed, as the ultimate gift from gods to their faithful servants. In reality, it would become the greatest betrayal in galactic history. Zarek, despite his misgivings about Katan influence, found himself unable to reject such an offer. The Silent King had watched countless generations of his people wither and die. He had personally overseen the funeral rites of hundreds of Triarchs before him. The burden of leading a species defined by its mortality had worn heavily upon him. If the Katan could deliver what the Old Ones had refused, perhaps their influence was a price worth paying. Preparations for the biotransference began in secret. The Katan, working through their Necrontyr disciples, designed and constructed vast complexes deep beneath the surface of key dynasty worlds. These facilities, known as transformation chambers, combined Necrontyr architectural sensibilities with Katan technological concepts that defied conventional physics. At the heart of each chamber stood massive biotransference engines, towering constructs of living metal and crystalline components that pulsed with emerald energy. The technology required for biotransference was unprecedented in its complexity. The process required mapping every neural pathway, memory, and personality trait of a Necrontyr mind, then transferring this data into a necrodermis shell configured to house consciousness. The necrodermis bodies themselves represented the pinnacle of metallurgical science, self-repairing, virtually indestructible, and responsive to the consciousness that would inhabit them. Initial tests were conducted on condemned criminals and volunteers from lower castes. These early subjects emerged from the process fundamentally changed. While they retained their memories and basic personality structures, subtle alterations were immediately apparent. Emotional responses were flattened, empathy diminished, loyalty to the Katan inexplicably enhanced. Most concerning, these test subjects reported a strange emptiness, a sense that something fundamental had been lost in the transfer. Zarek ordered extensive analysis of these results, but the Katan, particularly the Deceiver, assured him that these effects were merely temporary adjustment issues. The process would be refined, they promised, before being implemented on a larger scale. What the Silent King could not know was that these effects were not bugs, but features deliberately engineered by the Katan. When the biotransference engines were declared ready for mass implementation, the Deceiver suggested beginning with military forces. The logic seemed sound. Immortal soldiers would give the Necrontyr an immediate advantage against the old ones, and success on the battlefield would encourage civilian acceptance of the procedure. Zarek agreed, and the first full Necrontyr legions were marched into the transformation chambers. The biotransference process itself was a horror beyond imagination. Necrontyr subjects were placed in immobilization fields and systematically disassembled while still conscious. Specialized devices extracted their neural tissue, digitized their consciousness patterns, and transferred these patterns into waiting necrodermis shells. The original biological bodies were not merely discarded but consumed, broken down into energy that fed the Katan overseeing the process. Each transformation was, in reality, a sacrifice and a feast. The physical experience was excruciating. Subjects reported feeling every incision, every separation of flesh from bone, every moment of their biological death. The consciousness transfer itself was described by survivors as being simultaneously stretched across infinity and compressed into a singularity, a paradoxical sensation that drove some minds to immediate insanity. Then came the awakening in cold metal, the first moments of immortal existence accompanied by the horrifying realization that something essential had been stripped away. What the Katan had never revealed was that the biotransference process could not transfer the Necrontyr's souls. The immaterial essence that connected them to the warp was left behind, consumed by the Katan as the most exquisite part of the feast. The necrodermis bodies received only the data of consciousness, memories, personality, knowledge, but not the spark of true sentience that had made the Necrontyr truly alive. For most transferred Necrontyr, the result was a diminished existence. The majority of those who underwent the process emerged as little more than automatons, the basic warriors and laborers of what would become the Necron race. These unfortunates retained only fragments of their former personalities, operating primarily on programmed protocols, with occasional glimpses of their former selves manifesting as ghost-like memories or behavioral patterns. They could follow orders, perform complex tasks, and even adapt to battlefield conditions, but the creative spark, the capacity for growth and emotional connection was gone. The Necrontyr nobility fared somewhat better. The dynasty lords, pharaohs, and other high-ranking individuals received more sophisticated necrodermis bodies and underwent a more careful transfer process that preserved more of their personality and autonomy. While still diminished compared to their former selves, they retained enough of their identities to recognize the horror of what had happened. They could feel the absence of their souls, experience the muted shadow of emotions where once vibrant feelings had existed, and comprehend the full magnitude of the Katan's betrayal. Zarek himself, as befitted the Silent King, received the most advanced necrodermis body of all. His transfer was overseen personally by multiple Katan, ensuring that his mental faculties remained largely intact. When he emerged from the biotransference engine, he possessed enough of his former self to immediately understand the catastrophe that had befallen his race. The emptiness within him was mirrored in the vacant eyes of his transformed subjects, and the Silent King faced the terrible knowledge that he had condemned his entire species to a half-life of mechanical servitude. By the time Zarek fully comprehended the magnitude of the betrayal, it was too late. The biotransference had been implemented across the Necrontyr Empire with ruthless efficiency. Entire populations had been processed through the transformation chambers, emerging as the first generation of what would now be called Necrons. The living Necrontyr civilization, with all its flaws and suffering, had been systematically erased and replaced with a race of soulless metal constructs. The post-biotransference hierarchy established itself quickly, largely mirroring the former Necrontyr social structure, but with significant modifications. At the apex stood the pharaohs, former heads of the great dynasties who retained the most complete personalities and greatest autonomy. Their necrodermis bodies were masterpieces of Khatan technology, adorned with dynastic symbols and equipped with the most advanced weaponry and systems. They commanded vast territories and legions of lesser Necrons, ruling through command protocols hardwired into their subjects. Below the pharaohs were the Necron overlords, former nobles and military commanders who governed individual worlds or fleets. Their consciousness transfer had been prioritized above the common citizens, but below the dynasty heads, resulting in personalities that were functional but often obsessive or one-dimensional. Many overlords became fixated on particular aspects of their former lives: military conquest, scientific research, or artistic collection, pursuing these interests with a machine-like single-mindedness that bordered on programming. The Necron lords formed the next tier, serving as lieutenants to the overlords and pharaohs. These were former lesser nobles, accomplished warriors, or skilled administrators whose value had earned them superior necrodermis forms. They retained enough personality to take initiative and adapt to changing circumstances, but lacked the full autonomy of their superiors. Many lords specialized in particular functions: combat, cryptography, maintenance of tomb complexes, becoming living tools of their dynasty's will. The vast majority of the transformed Necrontyr became Necron warriors, mindless automata who retained almost nothing of their former selves. These unfortunates received the most basic necrodermis bodies, armed with Gauss flayers and programmed for combat and labor. They operated on simple command protocols, following orders without question and functioning as the backbone of Necron military and workforce. In rare moments of system fluctuation, warriors might experience brief flashes of memory or personality, momentary ghosts of their former lives that caused them to pause or behave erratically before the protocols reasserted control. Specialized variants emerged for particular functions. Immortals received more advanced combat bodies and slightly higher cognitive function for complex battlefield roles. Deathmarks became the assassins of the Necron forces, their bodies designed for dimensional shifting and precision elimination. Lichguard, drawn from warriors who had once served as bodyguards to nobility, received enhanced bodies and programming that hardwired absolute loyalty to their masters. Each variant represented a particular optimization of the necrodermis form for specific functions, rather than any preservation of individual identity. The most tragic cases were the flayed ones. These Necrons suffered catastrophic psychological damage during the biotransference process, emerging with corrupted programming that manifested as an insatiable hunger to wear the skin of living beings. Whether this resulted from a flaw in the process or deliberate sabotage by the Khatan Landdugger remains debated in fragmentary records. Regardless of cause, these unfortunate Necrons became horrific parodies of their former selves, collecting and wearing the flayed skin of their victims in a grotesque attempt to recapture their lost biological existence. For those Necrons who retained enough of themselves to comprehend their condition, the psychological impact was devastating. Imagine awakening to find yourself in a metal body, your senses muted, your emotions reduced to pale shadows, and an emptiness within that could never be filled. Many high-ranking Necrons developed obsessive behaviors or delusions to cope with their new existence. Some pretended they could still taste food or feel physical sensations. Others developed elaborate rituals that mimicked their former biological lives, going through the motions of eating, sleeping, or even reproduction with mechanical precision, but no actual function. The most aware Necrons experienced a profound existential horror. They had traded a short, painful existence for an eternal half-life. They could not truly feel, could not connect with the universe around them, could not even properly die. Suicide was impossible. The self-repair protocols of necrodermis bodies would restore them from almost any damage. Some Necrons attempted to destroy themselves completely, only to awaken in repaired bodies with the memory of their failed attempt added to their burden of consciousness. Zarek, fully aware and racked with guilt, faced the consequences of his decision. The Khatan, no longer bothering to maintain their pretense of partnership, began openly treating the Necrons as servants rather than allies. The star gods grew fat on the energy they had harvested during the biotransference, their power now vastly greater than before. They commanded their Necron legions to war not just against the Old Ones, but against all life in the galaxy, seeing all biological existence as nothing more than potential nourishment. The Silent King realized that he had not saved his people, but damned them. The immortality the Catan had promised was a hollow mockery, eternal existence without meaning, without joy, without even the comfort of an eventual end. The Necrontyr had ceased to exist, replaced by the Necrons, a race of soulless automata bound to the will of star-feeding entities that viewed them as tools rather than beneficiaries. The transformation of the Necrontyr into the soulless Necrons marked not just the birth of a new species, but the beginning of the most devastating conflict the galaxy had ever witnessed. With their new necrodermis bodies impervious to radiation, disease, and most conventional weapons, the Necron legions prepared to unleash vengeance upon the Old Ones who had denied them the gift of longevity. The first engagements between Necron forces and the Old One's empire occurred at the fringes of Old One territory. These initial skirmishes were probing actions, testing the capabilities of both forces against each other. The Necrons deployed from massive crescent-shaped harvest ships that loomed over targeted worlds like mechanical moons. From these vessels descended squadrons of ghost arcs and night scythes, delivering warriors to planetary surfaces with mechanical precision. The Old Ones, despite their advanced psychic technology, were initially caught unprepared by the nature of their new enemy. Their weapons, many designed to affect biological systems or manipulate the warp, proved ineffective against the necrodermis-clad attackers. Gauss weapons wielded by even the most basic Necron warriors disintegrated Old One defenders molecule by molecule, leaving nothing but scattered dust where once stood mighty warriors. A notable early confrontation occurred at the Old One outpost world of Kithaeron, a verdant planet that served as a scientific research station. When the Necron forces of the Sarek dynasty materialized on the surface, the Old One defenders attempted to use their standard psychic defenses, reality warping fields that would have torn apart biological invaders. These energies washed harmlessly over the Necron warriors, who advanced in perfect lockstep through the defensive perimeters, their glowing green eyes fixed on their targets with machine-like focus. The massacre that followed established a pattern that would repeat across countless worlds. The Old Ones, accustomed to facing biological adversaries susceptible to fear, pain, and exhaustion, found themselves against an enemy that experienced none of these limitations. Necron warriors continued fighting even when severed at the waist, their upper bodies dragging themselves forward to continue firing, while self-repair protocols slowly reconnected their separated parts. More disturbing to the Old Ones than the warriors were the Catan themselves, who occasionally manifested on battlefields to devastating effect. During the assault on Kithaeron, the Nightbringer descended personally upon the central research facility. Witnesses described reality itself seeming to darken around the obsidian figure as it moved through the Old One defenders. Those who met its gaze died instantly, their bodies crumbling to dust as something essential was drawn from them. The few survivors spoke of feeling an ancestral terror in the entity's presence, as though the concept of death itself had taken physical form. The Old One's leadership, gathered in their hidden sanctums deep within the webway, analyzed the reports from these early defeats with growing alarm. They recognized that the Necrons represented something unprecedented, not merely a new enemy, but a fundamental threat to the ordered universe they had helped shepherd for millions of years. The Catan, entities of pure materium who fed on living energy, stood opposed to everything the Old Ones represented with their mastery of the immaterium. Strategic assessment led the Old Ones to a sobering conclusion. Direct confrontation with Necron forces on equal terms would lead to defeat. The Necrons' technological advantages in conventional warfare, their indestructible bodies, their superior firepower, their ability to phase in and out of reality, made traditional battlefield tactics suicidal. Furthermore, each defeat strengthened the Catan, who fed on the deaths of the Old One's forces. This realization prompted a strategic withdrawal from exposed positions across the galaxy. The Old Ones abandoned numerous outpost worlds and research stations, pulling their populations and valuable technologies back to core worlds with enhanced defenses. These fortress worlds were selected for their strategic positions and connectedness to the webway, allowing Old One forces to move between them without risking interception by Necron fleets in real space. The most formidable of these strongholds was Azagotha, a massive artificial world constructed around a webway nexus point. Its defenses included concentric rings of reality distortion fields, automated weapon platforms that drew power directly from the warp, and psychically reactive living architecture that could reconfigure itself in response to threats. Azagotha became the primary command center for the Old One's war effort, housing their greatest scientific minds and military strategists. From these secure positions, the Old Ones began developing countermeasures against the Necron threat. Their scientists studied captured Necron technology, searching for weaknesses in the living metal or vulnerabilities in their operating systems. They discovered that while conventional weapons barely scratched Necrodermis, weapons drawing power from the warp could disrupt the bonds holding the living metal together. This finding led to the development of specialized anti-Necron armaments that channeled immaterium energies. Meanwhile, the Necrons continued their advance, methodically conquering system after system. Their tactics evolved beyond simple frontal assaults to include more sophisticated approaches. Necron cryptechs, specialists in various esoteric sciences, deployed technologies that could extinguish stars, reverse planetary rotation, or accelerate time within localized fields. Entire worlds aged millennia in moments, their populations withering to dust while Necron forces watched impassively. The most significant Necron advantage came from their anti-webway technology. The Katan, particularly one known as Nyadrazatha the Burning One, had developed methods to detect and breach webway corridors. This technology, incorporated into specialized Necron constructs called dolmen gates, allowed Necron forces to penetrate the Old One's primary means of secure transportation and communication. The first successful webway breach occurred approximately 20 years into the conflict. A Necron force led by the Overlord Zondrek of the Sodek dynasty used a prototype dolmen gate to penetrate a webway tunnel connecting two major Old One strongholds. The Necrons materialized within the tunnel itself, a feat previously thought impossible, and established a permanent presence there. From this foothold, they launched attacks directly into the heart of Old One territory, bypassing external defenses entirely. This breach represented a turning point in the war. The Old Ones had relied on the webway's inviolability as their primary strategic advantage. With that security compromised, even their most fortified positions became vulnerable to surprise attack. Emergency councils were convened in the depths of Azagotha, where the most ancient and powerful Old Ones debated their species' survival. The decision that emerged from these councils would reshape the galaxy forever. The Old Ones would create new species specifically designed for warfare against the Necrons. Unlike the Necrontyr, who had evolved naturally with all the limitations that entailed, these new races would be engineered from the molecular level up, their physical forms and psychic potential optimized for combat roles. This program of creation began with an assessment of what attributes would be most effective against Necron forces. Physical strength was necessary, but insufficient against Necrodermis bodies. Reproduction rate was crucial. The Old Ones needed warriors that could replenish their numbers quickly to counter the Necrons' ability to self-repair. Most importantly, these new species needed strong connections to the warp, the one domain where the Katan and their Necron servants were vulnerable. The first warrior species created by the Old Ones were the Krork, primordial ancestors of what would eventually become the Orcs. The Krork were massive, heavily muscled beings with thick, leathery green skin capable of withstanding tremendous damage. Their most remarkable feature was their reproductive system. Krork released spores throughout their lives that grew into new Krork, allowing their numbers to increase exponentially even during active combat operations. The Krork possessed a Gestalt psychic field that grew stronger as their numbers increased. This WOG energy manifested as an intuitive understanding of technology and combat tactics that no individual Krork could have developed alone. When gathered in sufficient numbers, Krork could instinctively construct and operate complex weapons and vehicles with no formal training. Their psychic field also reinforced their already formidable physical resilience, making them nearly impossible to eliminate completely once established on a world. Alongside the Krork, the Old Ones created the Eldar, a more gracile species with unparalleled psychic sensitivity. Where the Krork were blunt instruments designed for frontal assault and attrition warfare, the Eldar were precision tools meant for surgical strikes and psychic combat. Their slender bodies housed minds of extraordinary potential, capable of manipulating warp energies with a finesse the Old Ones themselves respected. The Eldar's primary advantage against the Necrons lay in their psychic abilities. They could sense the approach of Necron forces through disturbances in the warp, predict the movements of Necron units by reading probability threads, and most importantly, channel warp energies directly against necrodermis bodies and Katan shards. The most powerful Eldar psychers could temporarily sever the connection between a Necron's body and its controlling consciousness, rendering it inert. Other species followed as the Old Ones refined their creation techniques. The Kainib, insected warriors with hive minds that made them immune to the psychological warfare of the Deceiver. The Jakero, orangutan-like beings with an intuitive understanding of technology that allowed them to counter Necron adaptations. Dozens of specialized races emerged from the Old Ones' genetic laboratories, each designed to exploit a particular Necron weakness or counter a specific Katan ability. The deployment of these warrior species marked a shift in the war's momentum. For the first time, Necron advances were not just slowed but reversed. On the jungle world of Thanatar, a Krork infestation grew from a few hundred initial warriors to over 1 million in less than a month, overwhelming the Necron garrison through sheer numbers and brute force. Their crude but effective gravity weapons proved capable of disrupting the phase technology that Necron forces relied upon, preventing them from retreating into their pocket dimensions. The Eldar proved their worth during the Battle of the Crystal Labyrinth, a sprawling webway junction that had been infiltrated by Necron forces. A cadre of just 300 Eldar warriors, led by individuals who would later be remembered as the first Phoenix Lords, systematically eliminated a Necron force 20 times their number. They moved through the crystalline corridors like ghosts, appearing and disappearing at will, their weapons leaving trails of disrupted reality that prevented Necron's self-repair protocols from functioning. These victories came at a terrible cost. The Old Ones were directing vast amounts of psychic energy to empower their created warriors, drawing more deeply on the warp than ever before. This unprecedented level of psychic activity began to have effects on the Immaterium itself. The once calm sea of potential began to develop currents and eddies, the first stirrings of what would eventually become the Chaos Gods. The Necrons and their Katan masters responded to these setbacks with escalating brutality. Entire star systems were consumed by the Katan, their life energy converted into weapons of unimaginable power. The Breath of the Gods, a device created by the Katan known as Mephatron the Deceiver, could accelerate the life cycle of stars, causing them to go supernova on command. The resulting destruction cleared whole sectors of Old One influence and their created warriors. The Dolmen Gate technology continued to advance, allowing for larger and more precise webway breaches. Necron forces established permanent bases within the webway itself, creating fortresses of living metal that corrupted the surrounding Immaterium pathways. These corrupted sections began to destabilize, creating the first permanent tiers between real space and the warp, wounds in reality that would never fully heal. As the war expanded across the galaxy, the Old Ones found themselves fighting on two fronts. Against the Necrons and Katan in real space, and against the growing instability of the warp itself. Their created warriors proved effective against the first threat, but inadvertently worsened the second. The psychic emanations of billions of Krork, Eldar, and other psychically active species churned the warp into increasingly turbulent patterns. The first warp predators began to emerge, not yet the coherent entities that would later be known as demons, but formless hunters drawn to the psychic light of living minds. These entities found the Old Ones particularly appetizing, their ancient and powerful minds shining like beacons in the Immaterium. Several prominent Old One leaders fell not to Necron Gauss weapons, but to possession by these warp entities, their bodies transformed into grotesque vehicles for alien intelligences. As the war in heaven escalated beyond anything the galaxy had previously witnessed, the Old Ones recognized that conventional military tactics would prove insufficient against the Necron threat. Their initial defensive measures and tactical withdrawals had bought precious time, but a more permanent solution was required. The creation of specialized warrior races had begun with the Krork and Eldar, but these were merely the first iterations of what would become a comprehensive biological arsenal spanning the galaxy. The Krork, proto-ancestors of the modern orcs, were engineered with remarkable biological resilience. Standing significantly taller than their orc descendants, often reaching heights of 12 to 15 meters, the Krork possessed not only immense physical strength, but also a sophisticated innate understanding of technology. Their bodies featured integrated armor composed of a symbiotic fungal material that hardened upon exposure to combat stimuli, forming plates comparable to advanced ceramite in their protective capabilities. This armor was not merely defensive, but incorporated advanced weapon systems that grew more sophisticated as the Krork gathered in greater numbers. Unlike the modern orcs, whose technological understanding has devolved into a crude, instinctive knowledge, the Krork possessed genuine technical sophistication. Archaeological evidence from this period shows Krork void craft with gravitic systems and reality distortion engines that rivaled Necron technology in complexity, if not raw power. Their weapons combined advanced principles of gravitational manipulation with psychic amplification, creating tools perfectly suited to disrupt the phase-shifting capabilities of Necron warriors. The reproductive cycle of the Krork represented perhaps their most strategically valuable trait. Old One geneticists engineered them to release specialized spores throughout their lives, with production increasing dramatically upon death. These spores, resistant to radiation, vacuum, and most forms of sterilization, could lie dormant for centuries before activating under suitable conditions. This meant that once Krork were deployed to a world, their presence became virtually impossible to fully eradicate, a critical advantage against the methodical but ultimately limited numbers of the Necron forces. The true genius of the Krork design lay in their psychic gestalt field. While individual Krork possessed only modest psychic abilities, their collective consciousness generated an energy field that strengthened proportionally with their numbers. This field served multiple functions. It accelerated their already prodigious healing, enhanced their technological intuition, and most importantly, disrupted the quantum-level programming of nearby Necron units. Large Krork armies could literally cause Necron warriors to malfunction through proximity alone, their green-tinged psychic field interfering with the command protocols binding the Necron consciousness to their necrodermis bodies. Deployment of the Krork followed a specific pattern. Old One seed ships would deliver initial spore clusters to planets threatened by Necron advance. Within days, the first generation of warriors would emerge, immediately constructing crude but effective fortifications and weapons. By the time Necron harvest fleets arrived, they would face not an empty world, but an entrenched Krork defense force that grew larger with each passing hour. The first documented large-scale Krork victory occurred at the binary star system designated Gorkagra, where an estimated 17 million Krork warriors overwhelmed a Necron harvesting force through sheer attrition, losing over 15 million of their number, but replenishing faster than they could be destroyed. While the Krork represented the Old One's answer to the Necrons' numerical advantage and resilience, the Eldar were created as a counterpoint to the Catan themselves. The earliest Eldar differed significantly from their modern descendants. Their bodies were taller and more robust, though still slender by Krork standards, with elongated craniums housing brains with vastly expanded parietal lobes, the sections responsible for psychic potential. Their skin contained chromatophores allowing limited chameleonic abilities, while their eyes could perceive not only the visible spectrum, but also psychic emanations. The Eldar's most defining characteristic was their unparalleled connection to the warp. Where the Krork's psychic abilities were collective and instinctive, the Eldar possessed precise, individual control over immaterium energies. An Eldar could shape the warp with the same dexterity a sculptor shapes clay, creating effects that ranged from subtle probability manipulation to devastating reality-sundering attacks. This precision made them ideal for targeting the Catan, whose material nature made them vulnerable to warp-based assaults that bypassed their physical defenses. The Old Ones designed the Eldar social structure to maximize their effectiveness against the Necron threat. Small cadres of Eldar warriors, typically numbering between 50 and 200 individuals, would operate independently behind enemy lines, guided by Farseers whose psychic precognition allowed them to navigate the tangled threads of potential futures. These cadres specialized in targeting cryptechs, Necron lords, and occasionally Catan shards, disrupting the command structure of Necron forces rather than engaging their numberless warriors directly. The Eldar's most valuable contribution to the war effort came through their ability to navigate and manipulate the webway. Their innate psychic sensitivity allowed them to detect subtle fluctuations that indicated Necron intrusion attempts, sealing breaches before they could fully form. Specialized Eldar known as Pathfinders could even redirect webway tunnels during transit, leading pursuing Necron forces into carefully prepared ambushes or dead-end passages that would be collapsed behind them. The Battle of the Obsidian Vale demonstrated the devastating potential of Eldar warriors at their peak. A force of just 73 Eldar, led by a Psyker whose name translates roughly as She Who Sees Beyond the Veil, penetrated the command tomb of the Ogdobic dynasty. Using psychic techniques that rendered them imperceptible to Necron sensors, they reached the central command node, where a Catan shard of the Deceiver was directing operations. The resulting confrontation ended with the Catan shard temporarily banished, and the dynasty's command protocols disrupted for nearly a century of real space-time. Beyond these two primary warrior races, the Old Ones created numerous specialized species to fulfill specific tactical roles. Among the most notable were the Jakaro, simian creatures with orange fur and an intuitive understanding of technology that bordered on the supernatural. Standing roughly the height of a human child, Jakaro possessed 6-fingered hands of extraordinary dexterity and brains, specialized for understanding mechanical and energy systems. The Jakaro were not frontline combatants but technological countermeasures specialists. Their purpose was to analyze, understand, and neutralize Necron technology, particularly the more esoteric weapons and devices created by cryptechs. A Jakaro could examine a piece of Necron technology briefly and not only comprehend its function, but improve upon it or create a countermeasure within hours. Their most significant contribution came in developing methods to disrupt the quantum phase corridors used by Necron forces for interstellar travel, temporarily stranding Necron fleets in real space where they could be engaged on more favorable terms. The Canib represented another specialized creation, insected warriors whose hive mind structure rendered them immune to the psychological warfare tactics employed by the Deceiver. Standing approximately 2 meters tall on 4 chitinous legs, with 2 pairs of manipulator arms and compound eyes that could process information at speeds exceeding even Necron computational abilities, the Canib operated as perfect coordination units. Each individual Canib was connected psychically to its hive, sharing information instantaneously across vast distances. This hive structure proved particularly effective against Necron forces on the strategic level. While individual Canib could be destroyed as easily as any biological entity facing Gauss weapons, their distributed consciousness meant that tactical knowledge survived regardless of casualties. Canib forces quickly adapted to Necron patterns, developing countermeasures after just a few engagements, and sharing these adaptations across all hives simultaneously. The Old Ones deployed Canib primarily as strategic analysts and coordination nodes, linking the activities of other warrior races into coherent campaign structures. Less well-documented but equally significant were the Ration, aquatic beings created specifically to combat Necron operations in oceanic environments. With streamlined bodies measuring up to 10 meters in length and specialized organs that could generate powerful electromagnetic pulses, the Ration could disable Necron units that ventured into liquid environments. Their most notable success came at the oceanic world of Narthex, where Ration colonies lured an entire Necron splinter fleet into the planet's deep trenches before generating a synchronized electromagnetic pulse that disabled the Necron forces long enough for them to be crushed by abyssal water pressure. The deployment of these warrior races followed a carefully orchestrated pattern, utilizing the Old One's mastery of the webway. Specialized chambers within the webway network served as breeding and training facilities, protected from direct Necron attack by layers of reality distortion fields and psychic barriers. From these secure locations, the Old Ones could rapidly deploy their created warriors to threatened worlds using webway gates. The logistics of this deployment system represented a marvel of ancient technology and psychic engineering. Webway corridors could be temporarily expanded to allow the transit of entire armies, then contracted to prevent pursuit. Specialized gates incorporated one-way translation protocols, allowing biological matter to pass through while blocking the living metal of Necron bodies. Some gates were designed to fragment and reassemble across multiple points, making it impossible for Necron forces to target a single location for counterattack. For worlds of particular strategic importance, the Old Ones established permanent garrisons comprising complementary warrior species. A typical defense force might include a corps of Krork heavy infantry, supported by Eldar strike teams for precision operations, K-Nib coordinators to maintain strategic coherence, and Jakero technical specialists to counter Necron technological advantages. These integrated forces proved far more effective than single-species deployments, combining the unique strengths of each created race while mitigating their individual weaknesses. The effectiveness of these warrior races forced a fundamental shift in Necron tactics. No longer could they rely on straightforward harvesting operations and the overwhelming technological superiority that had characterized the early war. The Khatan, particularly the Deceiver and the Nightbringer, began developing more sophisticated approaches to counter the Old One's biological arsenal. One such countermeasure was the development of specialized Necron death marks, snipers who existed partially out of phase with normal reality, capable of targeting and eliminating key individuals within the Old One's forces. Deathmarks prioritized the leadership elements of the warrior races, particularly the more psychically powerful Eldar and the coordinating nodes of K-Nib hives. By removing these critical components, they could significantly reduce the effectiveness of the Old One's armies without having to engage their full numbers. Another adaptation came in the form of Canoptech scarabs, swarms of beetle-like constructs designed specifically to counter the Krork's reproductive advantage. These mechanical swarms would seek out and consume Krork spores, converting their biomass into more scarabs through molecular disassembly. On worlds where this strategy was successfully implemented, the Krork's exponential growth could be effectively contained, allowing conventional Necron forces to engage them on more equal terms. The war's escalation through these measures and countermeasures spread to encompass nearly the entire galaxy. Star systems previously untouched by advanced life became battlegrounds as both sides sought to secure strategic positions and resources. The Old One's warrior races spread through webway deployment, while Necron tomb complexes activated on worlds long thought barren or uninhabited. The conflict's scale expanded beyond conventional understanding, with battles raging simultaneously across thousands of worlds. As the war intensified, the warp itself began to change in response to the unprecedented levels of psychic activity generated by the Old Ones and their created races. The once calm immaterium grew turbulent, developing currents and eddies that reflected the emotions and thoughts of the combatants. This transformation would eventually have consequences far beyond the immediate conflict, but in the short term, it provided the Old Ones with an unexpected advantage. The growing instability of the warp made it increasingly difficult for Necron forces to predict and intercept webway movements, as the underlying fabric of reality itself became less stable and more responsive to psychic manipulation. The transformation of the Khatan from stellar entities into necrodermis-clad gods marked the beginning of their ascension to unprecedented power. While the Deceiver and the Nightbringer were among the first and most prominent of these beings to take physical form, they represented merely a fraction of the full Khatan pantheon that would eventually dominate the galaxy alongside their Necron servants. The Void Dragon, perhaps the most powerful of all the Khatan, manifested in a form that inspired both awe and terror. Standing nearly 20 meters tall, its necrodermis body resembled a great serpentine dragon with scales that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Where other Catan glowed with inner energies, the void dragon appeared as a slice of emptiness given form, its movements leaving momentary tears in reality that exposed the nothingness between dimensions. Its control over electromagnetic forces and technology was absolute. Machines in its presence would activate, deactivate, or reconfigure themselves according to its merest thought. Entire Necron armies could be empowered by its proximity, their living metal bodies functioning with greater efficiency and resilience when the dragon's shadow fell upon them. The Void Dragon's most devastating ability was its mastery of the fundamental forces that bound matter together. During the assault on the Old One fortress world of Calaxis, the dragon hovered above the battlefield and extended its consciousness into the planetary crust. Witnesses described how the very ground began to liquefy and reshape itself, mountains flattening and valleys rising to create a perfectly level plain that offered no cover for the defending forces. When the Old Ones deployed gravity manipulation technology to counter this effect, the dragon simply inverted the weapon's functions, causing them to implode and create localized singularities that consumed their operators. In contrast to the Void Dragon's cosmic majesty stood the Outsider, a Catan whose mental state could only be described as fractured. Its necrodermis form constantly shifted between shapes, sometimes appearing as a spindly humanoid figure with too many limbs, other times as a writhing mass of geometric shapes that defied Euclidean understanding. Those who gazed upon the Outsider for too long reported experiencing time differently, with seconds stretching into subjective years or complex sequences of events compressed into momentary flashes. The Outsider's madness manifested as reality distortions that affected friend and foe alike. During the Battle of the Seven Suns, the Outsider created a field where causality itself broke down. Weapons fired before triggers were pulled, warriors died before blades struck them, and spoken orders were heard before they were given. Even the Necrons found this entity disturbing, deploying it only against targets deemed too dangerous or valuable to approach conventionally. Lesser known but equally potent was Ayashudra, the Endless Swarm, a Catan that conceptualized itself as a collective rather than an individual. Its necrodermis body appeared as a constantly shifting cloud of metallic insects, each capable of independent action while remaining part of the greater whole. The Endless Swarm could disperse across an entire continent, simultaneously attacking thousands of targets while maintaining perfect coordination. Its preferred method of feeding involved engulfing entire population centers in its constituent parts, each metallic insect extracting life energy from individual victims before returning to the collective. The Endless Swarm proved particularly effective against the Old One's created races, as it could adapt its component forms to counter specific biological defenses. When facing Krork forces, the swarm would generate parasitic components that targeted the fungal reproductive system, preventing spore release. Against Eldar, it produced resonant frequencies that disrupted their psychic abilities, reducing their effectiveness to that of conventional warriors. Nyadrazatha, the Burning One, manifested as a constantly shifting pillar of golden flame contained within a humanoid necrodermis frame. Heat radiated from this entity in waves that could melt stone at 100 paces, while its touch could reduce even the most resilient materials to their component atoms. The Burning One's greatest contribution to the war effort was its development of the Dolmen Gates, technology that allowed the Necrons to breach the Old One's webway network. By applying its unique understanding of dimensional boundaries, Nyadrazatha created methods to detect the subtle ripples in reality that indicated webway passages, then forced these dimensional doorways open through controlled application of thermal energy at quantum levels. The Burning One led the first major webway incursion personally, stepping through a prototype dolmen gate into a primary arterial passage of the Old One's transportation network. The psychically reactive material of the webway corridor began to blister and char in the Catan's presence, creating a permanent scar in the network that would never fully heal. This breach allowed Necron forces to bypass the Old One's outer defenses entirely, striking directly at previously secure strongholds and research facilities. Landugr, the Flayer, represented perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Catan pantheon. Its necrodermis form appeared almost incomplete, a skeletal figure with exposed mechanical components and a face frozen in a silent scream. The Flayer's presence induced a peculiar hunger in both mechanical and biological entities nearby, a compulsion to strip away outer layers and expose what lay beneath. Necron warriors exposed to its influence for two long-developed glitches in their command protocols, becoming obsessed with collecting and wearing the flayed skin of their victims in grotesque imitation of their former biological existence. The Flayer's most notorious deployment occurred at the Siege of Hydrak, an Old One biological research facility where new warrior species were being developed. Rather than destroying the facility outright, the Flayer infiltrated its environmental systems and released a modified form of its influence, a contagious madness that caused the test subjects to turn on their creators, stripping away flesh and consuming it while the victims remained conscious. The psychological impact of this atrocity extended far beyond its tactical significance, creating a ripple of fear through Old One forces that hampered their operations for decades afterward. As the war progressed, the already godlike Catan discovered a new path to even greater power, consuming one another. This cannibalistic process began not as a planned strategy, but as an opportunistic attack when Landugr, the Flayer, found itself weakened after an engagement with particularly powerful Old One psychic weapons. The Nightbringer, sensing vulnerability, struck without warning, absorbing its wounded kindred's essence and experiencing an immediate surge in power. The consumed Catan's consciousness did not disappear entirely, but became subsumed within the Nightbringer, adding its unique perspectives and abilities to the stronger entity's repertoire. This first act of cannibalism established a precedent that would transform the nature of the Catan pantheon. The stronger began hunting the weaker, each consumption further consolidating power among a dwindling number of increasingly potent entities. The Deceiver proved particularly adept at this practice, using its mastery of illusion and misdirection to ambush even Catan that might have been its equal in direct confrontation. It would appear to be vulnerable, luring potential predators into traps before revealing its true strength and consuming them instead. The process of Catan consumption differed fundamentally from their feeding on biological life. When Catan devoured one another, they absorbed not just energy, but aspects of identity and capability. A Catan that consumed another with particular mastery over gravitational forces would find itself able to manipulate gravity with similar skill, though often with a distinctive personal variation. This led to increasingly complex and dangerous entities as the war continued, with each remaining Catan representing not an individual, but a composite of multiple star gods. By the midpoint of the war in heaven, the original pantheon of thousands had been reduced to perhaps 24 major Catan and a few hundred lesser shards and fragments. These survivors possessed power that dwarfed their original capabilities, enabling them to perform feats that bordered on the impossible even by the standards of this technologically advanced era. The Nightbringer, having consumed dozens of lesser Catan, demonstrated the ability to induce instant death through mere proximity. Its necrodermis body had grown to nearly 30 meters in height, constantly shifting between solid matter and energy states. The darkness that surrounded it was no longer merely visual, but a fundamental absence of energy that could extinguish even the most powerful containment fields. During the battle for the Webway Junction at Kaltyra, the Nightbringer passed through an Old One defensive line consisting of over 1,000 Krork elites and 17 Eldar psychic champions. None fired a shot or raised a weapon. They simply ceased to exist as the entity moved through their ranks, their life energy, and even their molecular structure absorbed into the Catan's being. The Deceiver, following its own path of consumption, developed reality manipulation abilities that made distinguishing truth from illusion impossible. It could create perfect simulacra of individuals, locations, or even entire star systems, maintaining these deceptions across vast distances and multiple sensory spectra simultaneously. The Deceiver's most devastating application of this ability came at the Conclave of Ulthuan, where the Old Ones had gathered their greatest strategic minds to plan a counter-offensive. The Catan infiltrated the gathering by creating a perfect copy of the meeting location and gradually shifting the real participants into its fabricated reality. For 3 months, the Old Ones' leadership believed they were coordinating a massive military response, while in reality, they were isolated in a pocket dimension, issuing commands to forces that never received them. The Void Dragon, already among the mightiest before the cannibalism began, grew to such power that its influence extended beyond individual star systems. It demonstrated the ability to create or extinguish stars at will, rearranging astronomical bodies like game pieces on a board. During the campaign against the Old One's stronghold in the Thanatos cluster, the dragon systematically extinguished 7 stars in a precise sequence, creating a gravitational cascade that pulled the cluster's worlds into new orbits. These orbits traced a complex pattern that, when viewed from the dimensional perspective of the webway, formed a seal that locked the local webway portals into a permanent closed state, isolating the defending forces from reinforcement or retreat. Perhaps the most terrifying development in Catan capabilities was their growing ability to rewrite the fundamental laws of physics within localized areas. The entity known as Magladroth demonstrated this by creating zones where the strong nuclear force was slightly weakened, causing atoms to become unstable. Anything entering these areas, biological or mechanical, would begin to deteriorate at the subatomic level, the effect accelerating with exposure time. Even necrodermis bodies were not immune, requiring constant energy expenditure to maintain their integrity when operating in these altered regions. This ability to modify physical constants reached its apex with the development of what Necron records called God codes, mathematical formulae that, when implemented through specific technologies, could temporarily override standard physical laws across entire planetary systems. The most notorious of these was the seismic equation, a code that altered the relationship between mass and gravitational attraction, allowing the Catan to literally tear planets apart from their cores outward. The first deployment of this weapon against the Old One's sanctuary world of Tyrik reduced a thriving ecosphere to an expanding cloud of debris in under an hour, killing billions of refugees and warrior constructs who had believed themselves safe behind the planet's formidable defenses. As the Catan's power grew through consumption and technological development, they began implementing longer-term strategies beyond immediate military objectives. Chief among these was the construction of the pylon networks, massive structures of living metal embedded into the crusts of thousands of worlds across the galaxy. These pylons, often standing hundreds of meters tall and extending kilometers below the surface, served a singular purpose: to separate the materium from the immaterium, weakening the Old One's connection to their primary power source. The most extensive pylon network was established on Cadia, a world positioned near a region of space where the boundary between reality and the warp was already naturally thin. The Cadian pylons were arranged in concentric rings covering much of the planet's surface, their black surfaces etched with glyphs that pulsed with emerald energy. When fully activated, these pylons projected a field that forced a strict separation between dimensions, making warp travel and psychic powers impossible within their influence. Similar but smaller networks were established on strategic worlds throughout the galaxy, creating zones where the Old Ones and their psychically active created races found themselves severely disadvantaged. The Eldar, whose combat effectiveness relied heavily on warp manipulation, were reduced to their physical capabilities alone when fighting near active pylons. Krork, bereft of their Gestalt field, became disorganized, their technological intuition failing as their connection to the warp was severed. The pylons represented more than tactical advantages, however. They formed part of a master plan conceived by the Catan to permanently reshape the galaxy to their preference. As beings of pure materium with no presence in the warp, the Catan found the immaterium's very existence distasteful. Their ultimate goal, revealed in fragments of ancient record, was nothing less than the complete separation of real space from the warp throughout the entire galaxy, a condition that would render the Old Ones powerless, while allowing the Catan to reign supreme over a universe bound solely by physical laws they could manipulate at will. This ambition demonstrated how far the Catan had evolved from their original nature as simply predatory stellar entities. They had developed a cosmic vision, a desire to reshape reality itself according to their preferences. Had they succeeded, the galaxy would have become a realm of perfect order, devoid of the chaotic potential represented by the warp, with all life existing merely to provide sustenance for the Catan's endless hunger. The implementation of this vision progressed steadily as the war in heaven reached its height. Thousands of worlds fell under Necron control, each subsequently fitted with pylon technology. The Old Ones found themselves increasingly confined to isolated strongholds and webway realms, as more and more of real space became hostile to their psychic nature. The created warrior races fought desperately to destroy or disable these pylons, recognizing them as an existential threat, but the living metal's self-repairing properties made permanent destruction nearly impossible without committing forces that could not be spared from other fronts. As the war in heaven reached its zenith, a new and unexpected threat emerged from the Immaterium. The Old Ones' extensive use of the warp to empower their created races had consequences far beyond their strategic calculations. The psychic awakening of billions of warrior beings across the galaxy created a resonance in the warp, a beacon that drew the attention of entities that had previously existed only in the deepest, most inaccessible regions of the Immaterium. The first signs of this new danger manifested on Ethala, an Eldar stronghold world near the galactic core. Reports described Eldar warriors suddenly convulsing, their bodies contorting as their heads swelled to grotesque proportions. Their skin would split open, revealing pulsating cerebral tissue shot through with tendrils of warp energy. Within hours, these transformed beings lost all semblance of their former selves, becoming living portals through which amorphous entities emerged into real space. These creatures, later termed enslavers, or Krell in various historical accounts, resembled floating cephalopods approximately 2 meters in diameter. Their translucent bodies pulsed with unnatural colors that seemed to shift between spectra, while dozens of tentacles trailing beneath them ended in neural interfaces capable of attaching to the spinal columns of other beings. Most disturbing was their apparent lack of conventional sensory organs. Instead, they perceived their surroundings through psychic means, detecting the mental emanations of potential hosts rather than physical stimuli. The enslaver's method of reproduction demonstrated a horrific efficiency. Once emerged through a possessed psyker, an enslaver would immediately seek out other psychically active beings, attaching its neural interfaces to their nervous systems. Rather than killing these victims outright, the enslaver converted them into psychic amplifiers, living broadcast stations that emitted signals into the warp, drawing more of their kind through the thinning dimensional barriers. A single enslaver could, within days, transform an entire settlement into a massive gateway for its species. The Old Ones initially mistook these incursions for a new Catan strategy, responding with conventional military countermeasures. This misunderstanding proved costly, as standard weapons proved minimally effective against creatures that existed partially in the Immaterium, even when manifested in real space. Energy weapons passed through their bodies with minimal effect, while physical projectiles caused damage that healed almost instantly as the enslavers drew energy directly from the warp to repair themselves. The Necrons and their Catan masters observed these early enslaver outbreaks with scientific curiosity rather than alarm. As beings with no presence in the warp, neither the Necrons nor the Catan were vulnerable to direct enslaver possession. Indeed, the Catan found a certain ironic satisfaction in watching the Old Ones' psychic creations become vectors for a new enemy. The Deceiver, in particular, studied the phenomenon closely, recognizing potential strategic advantages in this unexpected development. This period of observation ended abruptly when the scale of the enslaver threat became apparent. What had begun as isolated incidents rapidly escalated into a galaxy-wide plague. The psychic awakening of the warrior races had created a vulnerability that the enslavers exploited with devastating efficiency. Each possessed psyker became a beacon and gateway. Each new enslaver that emerged immediately created more gateways, and the cycle accelerated exponentially. The Old One's stronghold at Thalax fell not to Necron Gauss weapons, but to an enslaver infestation that began with a single compromised Eldar Farseer. Within 27 hours, the entire population of 8 million had either been possessed, converted into psychic amplifiers, or consumed to fuel the dimensional rifts that now pulsed across the planet's surface. Similar reports came from dozens, then hundreds of worlds, describing identical patterns of rapid infestation and total loss of control. The Krork proved somewhat more resistant to enslaver control than the Eldar, their more rudimentary psychic nature making them less attractive hosts. However, this advantage was offset by their tendency to gather in massive numbers, creating concentration points where even a single successful possession could lead to catastrophic outbreaks. The battle moon of Gorkagra, home to over 70 million Krork warriors being prepared for deployment against Necron forces, was lost in less than a week after enslavers emerged from a handful of infected shamans. The Old Ones attempted to develop countermeasures, creating specialized warrior strains with modified psychic signatures designed to be undetectable or unpalatable to the enslavers. The most promising of these was a variant of the Eldar with the ability to completely suppress their psychic emanations, rendering them effectively invisible to warp entities. These Null Eldar proved effective at infiltrating enslaver-controlled territories and eliminating the possessed hosts before they could serve as gateways. However, the time required to breed and train these specialized warriors could not match the exponential spread of the enslaver plague. More desperate measures followed. On worlds already heavily infested, the Old Ones deployed what records call psychic exterminatus, weapons that severed the connection between the materium and immaterium across entire planets. These devices, forerunners of the technology that would later be incorporated into Sisters of Silence Null ships, created zones where psychic activity became impossible. While effective at containing enslaver outbreaks, these measures also rendered the affected worlds useless as bases for the Old Ones' own psychically active forces, effectively seeding them from the war effort. The Necrons and Catan, initially untroubled by the enslaver plague, soon recognized its implications for their own plans. The uncontrolled tearing of the dimensional fabric threatened the carefully calculated pylon network strategy, creating unpredictable warp phenomena that could disrupt even necrodermis technology. More concerning, the rapid depopulation of conquered worlds meant a significant reduction in the life energy upon which the Catan fed. What had seemed a convenient weakening of their enemy now threatened to render their hard-won territories worthless. In response, the Necron forces adjusted their tactics to incorporate anti-enslaver protocols. Specialized cryptech constructs called plasmancers developed weapons that could disrupt the particular warp frequencies used by enslavers to maintain their partial materialization. Canoptech constructs were programmed to identify and eliminate possessed hosts before they could complete transformation into gateways. These measures proved moderately successful at protecting Necron-held territories, but did nothing to stem the overall spread of the infestation. The most effective Necron countermeasure came through accelerated deployment of the pylon networks. The Catan, particularly the Void Dragon, recognized that the technology designed to separate real space from the warp for their own purposes could also prevent enslaver incursions. Worlds with active pylon networks demonstrated complete immunity to the enslaver plague, as the dimensional barriers became too strong for the entities to penetrate. This led to a strategic reprioritization, with pylon construction taking precedence over offensive operations against the Old Ones. As the enslaver plague intensified, other warp predators began to emerge through the weakened dimensional barriers. Unlike the enslavers, which operated with a hive-like coordination, these entities appeared more individualistic and varied in form and function. Some manifested as clouds of sentient energy that consumed emotions, leaving their victims in catatonic states. Others appeared as amalgamations of impossible anatomies, beings with too many limbs, organs exposed on the outside of their bodies, or features that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Among the most dangerous of these secondary warp predators were entities that Old One records called psychivores, beings that fed specifically on the energy generated by advanced cognition. These creatures could drain the mental capacity from victims without physical contact, reducing even the most brilliant minds to vegetative states within moments of exposure. Several of the Old One's greatest scientists and strategists fell victim to psychivores, their accumulated knowledge of millennia erased in seconds, leaving only empty shells where once stood the architects of galactic civilization. Another classification of warp entity, termed chronophages in fragmentary records, manifested the ability to manipulate temporal flow in localized areas. These predators appeared as shifting crystalline structures that bent light in impossible ways, creating visual distortions around themselves. Their hunting method involved creating pockets of accelerated time around their prey, causing victims to experience subjective centuries in the span of hours, their bodies withering and minds breaking under the strain of compressed lifetimes. Particularly troubling was the chronophages' apparent preference for targeting the Old Ones themselves, perhaps drawn to their naturally extended lifespans. The combined pressure of the Enslaver Plague and these secondary warp predators forced a fundamental reassessment of strategy by both the Old Ones and the Necron-Catan alliance. The war in Heaven had transformed from a bilateral conflict into a three-sided struggle, with the emergent warp entities representing a threat potentially greater than either original combatant. This new paradigm led to the first instances of inadvertent cooperation between ancient enemies, as both sides found themselves containing enslaver outbreaks that threatened territories they claimed. For the Old Ones, the warp predation represented an existential crisis more severe than the Necron threat. As beings intimately connected to the Immaterium, they found themselves particularly vulnerable to these new enemies. Reports from this period describe Old One's sanctums falling not to external attack, but to internal subversion, as warp entities possessed or consumed the very beings who had mastered the Immaterium for millions of years. The cruel irony was inescapable. The Old One's greatest strength had become the vector for their destruction. The created warrior races suffered differently according to their design. The Eldar, with their sophisticated psychic architecture, proved both the most effective at combating warp predators and the most vulnerable to their influence. Eldar enclaves developed specialized mental disciplines to shield themselves, creating the first versions of what would later evolve into their infinity circuit technology. These measures provided some protection, but required constant vigilance and significant energy expenditure, reducing the Eldar's effectiveness as a fighting force against the Necrons. The Krork responded to the warp threat through biological adaptation, their fungal physiology evolving with remarkable speed to develop a form of collective psychic immunity. When enslavers attempted to possess Krork hosts, they increasingly found themselves trapped in partially materialized states, unable to fully emerge or retreat back to the warp. This adaptation spread through Krork spores across multiple worlds, creating pockets of resistance where the green-skinned warriors could continue fighting without fear of possession. However, this adaptation came at the cost of reducing their psychic gestalt field, diminishing the technological sophistication that had made them effective against Necron forces. As the war progressed into this three-sided phase, the battlefield itself began to change in fundamental ways. Regions of space where heavy fighting had occurred, particularly areas where significant psychic powers had been deployed, developed permanent abnormalities in the barrier between dimensions. These thin places became impossible to fully secure, as warp phenomena would manifest randomly, even without psychic triggers. Some worlds in these regions experienced reality fluctuations. Gravity would temporarily reverse, time would flow at different rates in different locations, or physical laws would briefly operate according to alternative parameters. The most severe of these distorted regions eventually coalesced into what would later be called warp storms, areas where the Immaterium and Materium blended together in churning maelstroms that rendered conventional travel impossible and psychic communication unreliable. These storms further fragmented the coherence of both the Old Ones and Necrons' military operations, isolating battle groups and cutting off supply lines. Some fleets caught in suddenly manifesting warp storms disappeared entirely, their fate unknown even to their masters. The Old One's command structure, already stressed by Necron advances, began to collapse under this additional pressure. Communication through the webway became increasingly hazardous as sections became infested with warp entities that could follow psychic signals to their source. Strategic coordination broke down into localized resistance, with individual Old One enclaves fighting for survival rather than victory. The unified war effort that had created and deployed the warrior races fragmented into isolated pockets of resistance, each developing their own approaches to the dual threats they faced. The final phase of the war in heaven unfolded with a terrible symmetry. As warp predation intensified across the galaxy, the Old Ones found themselves fighting a war on two fronts, against both the Necron-Catan alliance and the enslaver plague they had inadvertently helped unleash. This strategic nightmare forced the oldest species in the galaxy into increasingly desperate measures, hastening their ultimate downfall. On the fortress world of Azagatha, once the crown jewel of the Old One's defensive network, the situation deteriorated rapidly. The massive psychic defenses that had repelled countless Necron assaults now served as beacons to the enslavers, drawing them like moths to flame. The world's outer settlements fell first, each psychically gifted defender becoming a potential vector for infestation. Within 40 days of the initial outbreak, over 60% of the planet's defensive capabilities had been compromised. The Old One's leadership gathered in the central sanctum, a chamber shielded by overlapping fields of reality distortion and psychic dampening. Here, the eldest of their kind, beings who had witnessed the birth of stars and guided the evolution of countless species, debated their rapidly diminishing options. Tactical data flowed through crystalline matrices embedded in the chamber walls, displaying the catastrophic losses across their once vast empire. The Necrons, sensing weakness, launched a coordinated attack on Azagatha with unprecedented force. 7 dynasty fleets converged on the system, led by the Sautek, Nihilak, and Mefrit dynasties. The Void battle lasted 17 days, with crescent-shaped harvest ships exchanging fire with the Old One's psychically powered vessels. The defenders fought with desperate valor, but their numbers had been too severely depleted by the enslaver plague to maintain their defensive perimeter. On the 18th day, the Necron forces achieved orbital supremacy. The Silent King himself, Zarek, directed the final assault from his command barge. Night scythes darkened the skies above the central sanctum as waves of Necron warriors teleported directly into the heart of the Old One's command structure. The fighting in the corridors was brutal and methodical, with the Necrons advancing step by step through defenses that would have been impenetrable mere months earlier. The fall of Azagatha represented more than the loss of a strategic stronghold. It signified the collapse of the Old One's coordinated resistance. With their primary command center destroyed, their remaining forces fragmented into isolated pockets fighting for survival rather than victory. The Webway network, once their greatest strategic asset, became a liability as Necron dolmen gates and enslaver incursions compromised its integrity at thousands of junctures. The destruction of the Webway accelerated as both the Necrons and the warp entities targeted its fundamental structure. The Catan, particularly Nyadrazatha the Burning One, developed increasingly sophisticated methods for detecting and breaching Webway corridors. Using technology that could identify the subtle dimensional distortions created by Webway passages, Necron forces established permanent breaches at key junction points, deploying specialized constructs called dolmen gates to maintain these openings. Each breached section of the Webway created cascading failures throughout the network. The psychically reactive material that formed the Webway's structure began to deteriorate under these multiple intrusions, creating unstable regions where the boundaries between dimensions fluctuated unpredictably. Some passages collapsed entirely, while others became permanently connected to the raw warp, allowing enslavers and other predators direct access to what had once been secure transit routes. The Eldar, who had come to rely heavily on the Webway for deployment and supply, found themselves increasingly isolated as the network fragmented. Elite cadres that had been operating behind Necron lines suddenly lost their extraction routes, forcing them to fight desperate rearguard actions with no hope of reinforcement. supply lines to forward bases were severed, leaving entire armies without the psychically attuned weapons they needed to combat Necron forces effectively. On the world of Ethrana, an Eldar stronghold that had served as a major staging point for operations against the Ogdobic dynasty, the collapse of local webway sections led to catastrophe. 12,000 Eldar warriors found themselves stranded when their return portal destabilized mid-evacuation. The Necron forces, led by Overlord Zondrek, surrounded the remaining Eldar and deployed a device known as a null field matrix, a precursor to the later pylon technology that completely severed the area from warp influence. Stripped of their psychic abilities and cut off from reinforcement, the Eldar fought to the last warrior, their bodies ultimately harvested to feed the awaiting Khatan. The Krork suffered differently from the webway's destruction. Less dependent on the network for tactical mobility than the Eldar, they nonetheless relied on it for strategic deployment to threatened sectors. As this capability diminished, the Krork forces became increasingly fragmented, with massive armies stranded on worlds where they had been deployed. Without central coordination from the Old Ones, these Krork forces reverted to more primitive behavior patterns, fighting whoever they encountered, Necron, enslaver, or eventually each other. On Gorkammer, a death world that had been transformed into a Krork breeding ground, the severing of webway connections led to an unprecedented population explosion with nowhere to direct its aggression. The 20 billion Krork Warriors, originally intended for deployment across a dozen fronts, turned their attention to the Necron tomb complex buried beneath the planet's northern continent. The resulting conflict lasted for nearly 3 centuries, with endless waves of Krork hurling themselves against the Necron defenses in a war of pure attrition. By its conclusion, the planet's surface had been reduced to bare rock, while the Necron forces, though ultimately victorious, were so depleted that the tomb world would remain dormant until the 41st millennium. As the Old One's empire disintegrated, the question of their ultimate fate became one of the great mysteries of galactic history. Archaeological evidence and fragmentary records suggest 3 primary theories regarding their final disposition. The first and most widely accepted theory holds that the Old Ones were systematically exterminated, caught between the Necron-Khatan alliance and the enslaver plague they had inadvertently helped create. According to this account, the last significant populations of Old Ones made their final stand in a region near what would later be called the Ghoul Stars. Here, they deployed weapons of such devastating potential that they had previously been considered too dangerous to use, devices capable of accelerating entropy within targeted star systems, or creating localized tiers in the fabric of reality itself. These desperate measures proved insufficient against the combined threats they faced. Necron quantum technology allowed them to predict and counter the entropy weapons, while the reality tiers only provided additional access points for warp entities. The final Old One strongholds fell one by one, their defenders either disintegrated by Gauss weapons or consumed by warp predators. By the time the war in heaven reached its conclusion, this theory holds, not a single Old One remained alive in the galaxy. Evidence supporting this theory includes the discovery of what appear to be mass grave sites on worlds that once served as Old One strongholds. On Thanathos IV, Imperial archaeologists in the 38th millennium uncovered a chamber containing the remains of creatures matching the general physiological description of the Old Ones, their bodies bearing distinctive marks consistent with both Gauss weapon damage and warp entity predation. Carbon dating and other forensic techniques placed these remains at approximately 60 million years old, consistent with the estimated timeframe of the war in heaven's conclusion. The second theory suggests that a significant population of Old Ones escaped the galaxy entirely, using technologies beyond even the understanding of the Necrons to travel either to neighboring galaxies or to dimensions beyond conventional comprehension. Proponents of this theory point to certain anomalous energy signatures detected at the galactic rim, particularly in the region of the Eastern Fringe, which bear similarities to patterns associated with Old One technology in ancient records. This theory gained credence following the Horus Heresy, when expeditionary fleets from both Imperial and Traitor forces reported encountering structures of apparent Old One design on worlds at the very edge of the galaxy. These structures, described as stargates or void arches, appeared to be dormant transportation devices of incalculable power, designed to bridge distances far beyond those traversable by conventional warp travel. Whether these devices were successfully used for evacuation or abandoned before they could serve their purpose remains unknown. The third and perhaps most disturbing theory holds that the Old Ones did not die out, but rather transformed themselves into entities that could survive in the new galactic paradigm. According to this account, the most powerful Old Ones used their unparalleled mastery of the warp to shed their physical forms entirely, becoming pure immaterium entities similar in nature to the enslavers, but retaining their identities and purposes. These transcended beings would eventually form the pantheons worshipped by various species, including the Eldar gods, and potentially even the entities that would later be recognized as the Chaos gods. Supporting evidence for this theory includes the remarkable similarities between descriptions of certain Old One leaders and the attributes later assigned to Eldar deities such as Asurian and Isha. Additionally, psychic individuals throughout history have occasionally reported contact with entities claiming to be the ascended forms of the Old Ones, though such accounts are impossible to verify and often dismissed as the products of warp-induced hallucination or deliberate deception by chaos entities. Regardless of which theory holds the most truth, the practical outcome remained the same. The Old Ones ceased to exist as a cohesive civilization or influence on galactic affairs. Their absence created a power vacuum unprecedented in cosmic history, a galaxy suddenly without its oldest and most sophisticated guiding intelligence. This vacuum did not last long. As the Old One's influence receded, the Necron-Catan alliance moved swiftly to consolidate control over the conquered territories. Tomb complexes were established on thousands of worlds, while the Catan glutted themselves on the life energy of countless species who had previously enjoyed the Old One's protection. For a brief period, it appeared that the Catan would achieve their ultimate goal, a galaxy purged of warp influence and subject entirely to their material dominion. The immediate aftermath of the Old One's fall saw rapid changes across the galaxy. Worlds that had been centers of advanced civilization for millions of years fell into technological regression as their mentors and protectors vanished. Species that had been uplifted by the Old Ones found themselves suddenly abandoned, forced to fend for themselves in a hostile universe they were ill-prepared to navigate independently. Among the created warrior races, responses varied according to their design and capabilities. The Eldar, possessing the greatest inherent intelligence and adaptability, established their own civilization in the ruins of their creator's empire. They claimed key webway junctions and former Old One strongholds, developing technologies that, while less advanced than those of their creators, far surpassed anything other surviving species could achieve. The seeds of what would become the Eldari Empire were planted in this chaotic period, though it would take millions of years for this civilization to reach its zenith. The Krork, deprived of the Old One's guiding influence, underwent a gradual but profound degeneration. Without external enemies to fight in sufficient numbers, they increasingly turned on each other, their society becoming more primitive with each passing millennium. The sophisticated biological knowledge and technological intuition engineered into them by the Old Ones gradually faded, replaced by cruder approximations passed down through increasingly garbled oral traditions. Over millions of years, they would devolve into the orcs recognized in the current era, retaining their ferocity and reproductive capabilities, but losing much of their original purpose and sophistication. Other created races faced extinction or extreme adaptation. The Jakaro retreated to isolated worlds, their technological genius turning inward toward survival rather than warfare. The Kainib, their hive mind structure making them particularly vulnerable to enslaver infestation, were almost entirely wiped out, with only small populations surviving in regions where the warp's influence was naturally minimized. Countless other species engineered by the Old Ones disappeared entirely, leaving behind only fossilized remains or fragmentary references in ancient texts. Perhaps the most significant consequence of the Old One's fall was the permanent alteration of the warp itself. The Immaterium, once a relatively calm sea of potential, had been churned into increasingly turbulent patterns by the psychic emanations of the war in heaven. The sudden removal of the Old One's stabilizing influence, combined with the fear and suffering of countless dying species, created psychic shockwaves that would eventually coalesce into the first proto-chaos entities, embryonic forms of what would later become the Dark Gods. Zarek, the Silent King, stood at the observation deck of his command barge, gazing out at the stars his people had conquered. Victory against the Old Ones was nearly complete, yet he found no satisfaction in this triumph. The metallic body that housed his consciousness felt alien even after millennia of existence. Though his necrodermis form was the most sophisticated ever created, adorned with dynastic regalia and equipped with technologies beyond comprehension, it remained a prison rather than a vessel of transcendence. The Silent King had begun to understand the true nature of the bargain struck with the Khatan. What had initially seemed like salvation from mortality had become eternal enslavement. The biotransference had not merely transferred Necrontyr consciousness into metal bodies, it had fundamentally altered them, stripping away something essential that could never be recovered. The Khatan had fed on these discarded elements, growing fat on the spiritual essence of an entire species. Zarek's realization came gradually through careful observation. He noted how the Khatan's demands grew more imperious with each victory, how they increasingly treated the Necrons as servants rather than allies. The Deceiver no longer bothered maintaining the pretense of partnership in private councils, openly referring to Necron warriors as our tools and conquered populations as our cattle. The Nightbringer, less subtle than its golden counterpart, simply consumed entire regiments of lesser Necrons when they failed to meet its expectations, absorbing their living metal into its own form. Most damning was the evidence Zarek uncovered regarding the biotransference process itself. Hidden deep within the memory cores of the original biotransference engines, the Silent King discovered technical specifications that revealed the deliberate deception. The Khatan had modified the process to not merely transfer consciousness, but to remove specific components, what the ancient Necrontyr would have called the soul. These components had been systematically harvested during the transformation, providing the Khatan with a feast of unprecedented scale. This discovery triggered something akin to rage in Zarek's diminished emotional spectrum. The existential horror of what had been done to his people crystallized into a single, overwhelming imperative. The Khatan must pay for their betrayal, yet the Silent King recognized the seemingly insurmountable challenge this presented. The Khatan were at the height of their power, glutted on the life energy of countless species and the stolen essence of the Necrontyr themselves. Direct confrontation seemed impossible. Zarek began his preparations in absolute secrecy. He established a secure communication network using quantum entanglement technologies that even the Khatan could not detect or intercept. Through this network, he reached out to those Necron lords who had retained enough of their original personalities to comprehend the magnitude of the Khatan's betrayal. The pharaohs of the major dynasties, Sautek, Nihilak, Mefrit, and others, received encrypted data packets containing evidence of the Khatan's deception and the first outlines of Zarek's audacious plan. The response was not unanimous. Some dynasty lords had become too corrupted by the biotransference, their minds degraded to the point where they could not grasp complex concepts like betrayal or revenge. Others had developed symbiotic relationships with their Khatan masters, serving as favored lieutenants and receiving power and privilege in exchange for absolute loyalty. These potential obstacles were carefully noted, and Zarek adjusted his plans accordingly. Trazyn, already showing the collecting tendencies that would define his later existence, proved an unexpected ally. His obsession with preserving historical artifacts had led him to maintain extensive records of pre-biotransference Necrontyr society. These records provided irrefutable evidence of what had been lost, strengthening Zarek's case among the wavering dynasty lords. Trazyn's price for this assistance was typically idiosyncratic, exclusive access to certain Old One artifacts and technologies that the Silent King had secured during the final campaigns. Orican the Diviner, whose mastery of chronometric technology allowed limited glimpses into potential futures, provided crucial strategic insights. His calculations suggested a narrow window of opportunity approaching, a moment when the Catan, believing victory complete, would disperse across the galaxy to claim individual domains. This separation would temporarily reduce their collective strength, creating vulnerability that could be exploited if the Necrons struck with perfect coordination. The technical challenge of defeating the Catan remained daunting. These were beings that could manipulate the fundamental forces of reality, entities that had consumed stars and each other to reach godlike power. Conventional weapons, even the most advanced in the Necron arsenal, would be insufficient. Zarek directed the most brilliant remaining cryptechs to develop new technologies specifically designed to combat their former masters. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Analysis of the biotransference process had revealed that the Catan, for all their power, were bound by certain physical constants when manifested in necrodermis bodies. The living metal that gave them physical form also imposed limitations, quantum-level restrictions that could potentially be exploited. If the necrodermis could be destabilized in specific ways, the energy being contained within might be forcibly dispersed rather than released in a controlled manner. This insight led to the development of what Necron records call fractal-edged weapons, devices that could cut not just through physical matter, but through the dimensional bonds holding the Catan's energy in coherent patterns. These weapons operated on principles that defied conventional physics, using recursive algorithms to create edges that existed simultaneously at multiple quantum states. When such a weapon struck necrodermis housing a Catan, it created cascading disruptions throughout the entity's energy matrix. The most powerful of these weapons took the form of a massive device called the entropic field generator. This machine, large enough to require dedicated transport ships, could project a field that temporarily suspended the laws of thermodynamic conservation within a targeted area. When a Catan was caught within this field, the normal processes that allowed it to maintain coherence would break down, causing its energy to dissipate across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Testing these weapons required extreme caution. Zarek authorized experiments on lesser Necron constructs, carefully monitoring the results while ensuring no hint of these activities reached the Catan. The initial tests proved promising. The fractal weapons could indeed disrupt necrodermis at a fundamental level, causing energy contained within to disperse unpredictably. However, the researchers warned that using such weapons against the Catan would likely have far more dramatic and potentially catastrophic effects. As the technical preparations advanced, Zarek focused on the equally crucial task of securing the loyalty of the Necron military apparatus. The command protocols embedded in every Necron warrior theoretically gave the Silent King absolute control, but centuries of Catan influence had created backdoors and overrides in these systems. Zarek worked with trusted cryptechs to purge these vulnerabilities, restoring the integrity of the command structure with himself at its apex. The plan that emerged from these preparations was breathtaking in its ambition and terrifying in its potential consequences. Rather than attempting to destroy the Catan completely, a task deemed impossible given their fundamental nature as energy beings, Zarek proposed to shatter them into fragments or shards. Each shard would contain a portion of the original entity's power and aspects of its personality, but none would retain the godlike capabilities of the whole. These shards could then be captured in tesseract labyrinths, extra-dimensional prison devices designed to contain even the most powerful energy beings. The timing of the rebellion was calculated with mathematical precision. Oricon's chronometric projections identified a specific moment when the alignment of certain stellar bodies would create a temporary weakening in the Catan's connection to their power sources. This astronomical configuration occurred only once every 27 million years, making it both the perfect opportunity and the only opportunity the Necrons might have. 60 solar days before this alignment, Zarek began moving his forces into position. Necron fleets were redistributed across the galaxy under the pretense of securing newly conquered territories. Key tomb worlds activated reserve forces that had been held in stasis since the early phases of the war. Tesseract labyrinths were manufactured in hidden facilities and distributed to strike teams specially configured for the unique capabilities of each targeted Katan. The Katan, consumed by their own plans for reordering the galaxy, remained oblivious to the threat developing within their own ranks. The Deceiver, perhaps the most perceptive of the star gods, noted unusual patterns in Necron fleet deployments, but dismissed them as inefficiencies resulting from the degraded mental states of their servants. The Nightbringer, focused entirely on feeding upon the remnants of biological life in the Ghoul Star's region, ignored reports from its subordinates about unusual energy signatures detected near primary Necron command nodes. 3 days before the planned uprising, a potential catastrophe emerged. A cryptech loyal to the Void Dragon discovered evidence of the fractal weapon development and attempted to warn its master. The message was intercepted by Zarek's security protocols, but the damage was done. The cryptech's sudden silence alerted the Void Dragon to a potential issue. The Katan began actively scanning Necron communication networks, searching for anomalies that might explain its servant's disappearance. Zarek made the difficult decision to accelerate the timeline. Orders flashed through the quantum entanglement network. All forces were to initiate the attack immediately, before full preparations were complete. This adjustment reduced the calculated probability of success from 78% to just under 44%, but waiting would have meant certain discovery and failure. The rebellion began at the Battle of Mandragora, where Zarek himself led the attack against the Deceiver. The Katan had gathered a massive force to witness the activation of a supreme pylon network that would permanently separate real space from the warp across an entire sector. As the Deceiver raised its arms to initiate the activation sequence, Zarek gave the signal. 12 Tesseract arcs surrounding the ceremony site activated their entropic field generators simultaneously, creating an overlapping pattern that engulfed the unsuspecting Katan. The Deceiver's reaction was immediate and violent. Its necrodermis form, contorted as internal energies, rebelled against the suddenly imposed dimensional constraints. Golden light erupted from fissures that appeared across its surface, while reality itself seemed to warp around the struggling entity. The Deceiver reached out with both physical and metaphysical power, attempting to disable the field generators through brute force. Zarek had anticipated this response. As the Deceiver focused its attention on the entropic fields, a second wave of attackers emerged from dimensional pockets where they had been concealed. These specialized Lichguard wielded hyperphase swords modified with fractal edge technology. They struck in perfect coordination, their weapons slicing through the Deceiver's necrodermis at precisely calculated angles. The effect was catastrophic beyond even Zarek's predictions. The Deceiver did not merely break apart, it shattered like glass struck by a hammer, each fragment containing a portion of the entity's power and consciousness. Where once stood a unified god-like being now hovered dozens of shards, each a diminished reflection of the original. These shards lashed out in confusion and rage, but without the coordinated purpose of the complete entity, they could be contained by the waiting Tesseract labyrinths. Across the galaxy, similar scenes played out with varying degrees of success. The Nightbringer, ambushed while feeding on a recently conquered world in the galactic north, shattered into fewer but larger fragments, each containing more significant portions of the original entity's power. 3 of these major shards escaped containment, disappearing into the void to become persistent threats that would haunt the galaxy for eons to come. The Void Dragon proved the most difficult target. Forewarned by the sudden silence of its informant, this Katan had prepared defenses against potential betrayal. When Necron forces under Pharaon Amontek of the Sodek dynasty launched their attack, they found themselves facing not just the dragon itself, but an array of defensive constructs specifically designed to counter the fractal weapons. The resulting battle devastated an entire star system, with both sides employing technologies capable of manipulating fundamental forces. The Void Dragon's resistance was finally overcome through a desperate gambit by Amontek himself. The Pharaon, recognizing that conventional approaches had failed, ordered his command barge to ram directly into the dragon's necrodermis form while overloading its dimensional engines. The resulting explosion created a localized reality implosion, that momentarily disrupted the dragon's defensive fields, allowing the waiting fractal weapons to strike. Though successful, this attack came at tremendous cost. Amontek's consciousness was irrevocably damaged, and the Sodek forces suffered casualties exceeding 80% of their deployed strength. The lesser-known Khatan faced similar fates, though accounts of these engagements remain fragmentary in surviving records. The Burning One was ambushed while examining a dolmen gate, its form split into hundreds of tiny shards that were quickly contained. The Endless Swarm, perhaps due to its already distributed nature, proved particularly difficult to shatter completely, with numerous fragments escaping into deep space. The Flayer, caught in the midst of feeding upon a recently conquered population, suffered a unique fate. Its sharding released a retaliatory energy pulse that infected the attacking Necrons with a degenerative code virus, creating the first of what would later be known as the Flayed Ones. As the rebellion progressed, the remaining Khatan became aware of what was happening and attempted to coordinate a response. This led to the most devastating phase of the conflict, as fully aware Khatan deployed their reality-altering powers without restraint. Entire planets were reduced to atomic dust, stars were extinguished or forced into premature supernovae, and the very fabric of space-time was twisted into configurations that defied comprehension. The Necrons countered with their most destructive weapons, technologies that had been deemed too dangerous to use even against the old ones. The galaxy lay in ruins. Entire star systems had been reduced to drifting debris, planets shattered like clay pots dropped from great heights. The once mighty Necron dynasties, victorious against the old ones but devastated by their rebellion against the Khatan, faced a critical decision. Their numbers had been severely depleted through the war in heaven and the subsequent betrayal of their star gods. The few remaining Eldar were beginning to expand across the stars, and numerous other species were emerging on worlds throughout the galaxy. Zarek, the Silent King, surveyed the cost of victory from his command throne. The data streams flowing into his consciousness painted a grim picture. Over 60% of all Necron forces had been destroyed beyond recovery in the final confrontation with the Khatan. Many of the survivors were damaged, their necrodermis bodies showing signs of degradation that self-repair protocols could not fully address. The energy requirements to maintain their current operational status would soon exceed available resources. More concerning than the physical damage was the mental deterioration affecting many of the survivors. The command protocols linking the Silent King to his legions showed increasing instability. Warriors that had functioned perfectly for millennia now exhibited behavioral anomalies, pausing mid-action, repeating movements unnecessarily, or simply shutting down without apparent cause. Higher-ranking Necrons weren't immune either. Several overlords had developed obsessive behaviors or memory fragmentation that compromised their effectiveness. The Flayer virus, unleashed when the Khatan of the same name was shattered, presented an additional threat. This insidious code infection spread through proximity, causing affected Necrons to develop a horrific compulsion to collect and wear the skin of living beings. The first cases had been isolated and contained, but new outbreaks continued to appear, suggesting the virus could lie dormant before manifesting. Without intervention, it might eventually corrupt the entire species. Against this backdrop of physical and mental deterioration, Zarek recognized that the Necrons could not maintain their dominance of the galaxy in their current state. Their victory had come at too great a cost. The remaining Necron forces, while still formidable, lacked the numbers and resources to simultaneously hold their conquered territories, hunt down the escaped Khatan shards, and contain the emerging younger races. After consulting with the remaining Pharaons and his most trusted advisors, Zarek decreed what would become known as the Great Sleep. The Necrons would enter a state of stasis, their consciousness suspended while their bodies underwent repair and regeneration. This dormancy would last for 60 million years, a time span calculated to allow the galaxy to forget their existence while providing sufficient time for their systems to fully restore. The implementation of this strategy required the establishment of tomb worlds, planets converted into massive stasis facilities where the Necron legions could safely slumber. Each dynasty was instructed to select worlds within their territory that met specific criteria. geological stability, defensible positions, and isolation from likely paths of developing civilizations. These worlds would be transformed into fortresses designed to endure for tens of millions of years. The construction of the Tomb Worlds represented the final great engineering project of the Necron Empire before their withdrawal. Thousands of planets were hollowed out, their cores replaced with vast computational arrays and power generation systems. Layer upon layer of defenses were installed, from conventional weapon emplacements to reality-altering devices that could remove portions of the tomb from normal space-time if threatened. The architecture of these tombs followed consistent patterns while incorporating each dynasty's aesthetic preferences. The Sodek dynasty favored massive, imposing structures with sharp angles and prominent dynastic iconography. Their tombs typically extended kilometers below the planetary surface, with multiple redundant chambers arranged in concentric circles around a central stasis vault. The Nihilak preferred more intricate designs, their tomb complexes resembling three-dimensional labyrinths with numerous false passages and trap-filled decoy chambers to confuse potential intruders. The technological sophistication of these structures far exceeded anything that would exist in the galaxy for millions of years to come. The stasis crypts themselves operated on principles that partially removed their occupants from the normal flow of time. A Necron warrior placed in one of these crypts would experience the passing of 60 million years as nothing more than a momentary discontinuity, closing their eyes in one era and opening them in another with no subjective time passing between. The power requirements for maintaining this stasis field across an entire tomb world were enormous. Each facility incorporated multiple redundant energy sources, geothermal taps extending to the planet's core, stellar energy collectors in orbit around local stars, and in some cases, contained dimensional pockets where artificial stars provided constant power. These systems were designed to operate autonomously for the entire duration of the Great Sleep, with self-repair capabilities and adaptive algorithms to address unforeseen circumstances. Protection of the sleeping Necrons was entrusted to specialized constructs designed to remain active during the long dormancy. Canoptech scarabs, beetle-like machines roughly the size of a human hand, would patrol the tomb corridors in endless swarms, repairing any damage to the physical structures and eliminating small intruders. Canoptech spiders, much larger constructs resembling arachnids with multiple manipulator limbs, supervised these scarab swarms and handled more complex maintenance tasks. For defense against more significant threats, Tomb Worlds deployed Canoptech wraiths, spectral, serpentine constructs capable of phasing through solid matter. These guardians could move through walls and floors, appearing seemingly from nowhere to eliminate intruders. The most formidable defensive construct, the Canoptech Sentinel, resembled a massive mechanical scorpion with a focused energy projector where a biological creature would have a stinging tail. These rare constructs were typically assigned to guard the most critical sections of a tomb, such as the stasis chambers housing dynasty lords or the containment facilities for captured Khatan shards. Beyond these active defenses, the Tomb Worlds incorporated numerous passive protection systems. Many were built beneath the surfaces of seemingly dead worlds, with no external structures to betray their presence. Others were hidden within asteroid fields or beneath the ice caps of frozen planets. Some dynasties went so far as to position their tombs within unstable star systems, calculating that the hostile environment would discourage exploration by emerging species. The awakening protocols established for these tomb worlds balanced automation with hierarchy. Each facility was programmed to begin revival procedures after the predetermined 60 million years had passed, starting with the cryptechs and technical specialists needed to ensure all systems were functioning correctly. These initial awakened personnel would then revive the nobility and command structure, who would assess the galactic situation before determining whether to awaken the warrior classes. Additional triggers could initiate premature awakening if specific conditions were met. Major breaches of outer defenses, detection of Khatan energy signatures in proximity to the tomb, or significant seismic events that threatened structural integrity would all prompt the revival of defensive forces. These contingency protocols were designed to ensure the tomb worlds could protect themselves even if awakened before the intended time. Communication between tomb worlds during the Great Sleep was minimal but not entirely absent. Quantum entanglement networks connected major dynasty centers, allowing for the exchange of critical data even while most systems remained dormant. These networks operated on extremely limited bandwidth, sufficient to transmit binary alert codes but not complex information. The intent was to prevent cascading premature awakenings while still allowing for coordinated responses to galaxy-wide threats. As the Necron race prepared for their long dormancy, Zarek made his final address to the assembled pharaons and overlords. The Silent King acknowledged his responsibility for the biotransference that had reduced their species to soulless machines, and for the rebellion against the Khatan that had left them too damaged to maintain their empire. As penance for these decisions, Zarek announced that he would not join his people in the Great Sleep. Instead, he would exile himself from the galaxy entirely, traveling into the intergalactic void to contemplate his failures and seek potential redemption for his people. This announcement sent shockwaves through the Necron command structure. The command protocols binding the Necron hierarchy had been centered on the Silent King since the species' creation. His voluntary removal from this system meant that upon awakening, the dynasties would no longer be bound by his overriding authority. Each pharaon would become truly autonomous, free to pursue their own agendas without reference to a central authority. Some historians have suggested this was Zarek's final gift to his people, a restoration of the independence they had possessed as biological beings. Others view it more cynically, as an abdication of responsibility for the difficult rebuilding process that would follow the Great Sleep. Whatever his true motivation, the Silent King's departure marked the end of unified Necron civilization. When they would eventually awaken, it would be as competing dynasties rather than a cohesive empire. The actual process of entering the Great Sleep occurred in stages over approximately 3 centuries. Warrior classes were the first to enter stasis, their simpler consciousness patterns requiring less complex preparation. The immortals and specialized troops followed, then the lesser nobility and administrative castes. The cryptechs responsible for maintaining and activating the stasis systems were among the last to enter dormancy, carefully checking all systems before taking their places in specially designed crypts that would revive them first upon awakening. As the final Necron centers went offline and the last tomb worlds sealed themselves, the galaxy entered a new phase. The few remaining Eldar, freed from the threat of Necron domination, began to expand and develop what would become their own empire. Other species, some natural evolutions and others degraded remnants of Old One creations, established footholds on worlds throughout the galaxy. For most of these emerging civilizations, the Necrons were at most legends, incomprehensible ancient destroyers who had vanished as mysteriously as they had appeared. The 60 million years of the Great Sleep would not pass without incident for the dormant Necrons. Despite the incredible durability and redundancy built into the tomb worlds, no system could function perfectly across such an immense time span. Stellar fluctuations, geological shifts, meteor impacts, and the simple entropy of the universe all took their toll on the sleeping facilities. On Thanatos III, a relatively minor tomb world of the Oriskar dynasty, a stellar flare from the system's primary star overwhelmed the protective shields 17 million years into the Great Sleep. The resulting radiation surge damaged the primary control systems, causing a cascade failure that corrupted the stasis field generators. When this tomb eventually reactivated, nearly 20 million years early due to the malfunction, its occupants emerged with catastrophic memory degradation. These Necrons retained their basic combat protocols, but had lost all sense of identity or purpose, becoming mindless automatons that attacked any living creature they encountered. The tomb world of Nephrek suffered a different fate when a tectonic shift diverted a magma flow through its lower levels. The Canoptech constructs successfully contained the damage and rerouted critical systems, but not before several stasis chambers were compromised. The affected Necrons, including a lord and his court, were subjected to extreme gravitational stress as their stasis fields fluctuated. Upon eventual awakening, they manifested a unique condition, Their necrodermis bodies continuously emitted golden light, and they developed an obsession with transcendence and ascension to a higher state of being. Perhaps the most dramatic tomb failure occurred at Halath, where an impact from a rogue planetoid breached the outer defenses 28 million years into the Great Sleep. The automated systems awakened a portion of the defensive forces to address the threat, but damage to the command protocols prevented them from returning to stasis after the danger had passed. These Necrons remained active for millions of years with no purpose beyond patrolling their partially ruined tomb, developing increasingly erratic behaviors as their isolation continued. By the time the main stasis crypts activated on schedule, these Guardian forces had evolved their own culture and belief system, viewing the newly awakened tomb occupants as intruders rather than masters. These failures, while significant, were exceptions rather than the rule. The vast majority of tomb worlds functioned as intended, their occupants slumbering undisturbed as the galaxy transformed around them. Civilizations rose and fell, species evolved and went extinct, and the stars themselves shifted in their courses, all while the Necrons remained in their deathless sleep, waiting for the appointed time to reclaim what they viewed as their rightful domain. Meanwhile, beyond the edge of the galaxy, Zarek began his self-imposed exile. The Silent King's journey took him far from the stellar light of the Milky Way into the darkness between galaxies. His massive command barge, accompanied by a small fleet of attendant vessels crewed by his Praetorian Guard, traveled for centuries before reaching the True Void, a region where the distance between stars was measured in millions of light years rather than mere thousands. In this empty realm, Zarek contemplated the failures that had led his species to their current state. He reviewed the decision to accept the Khatan's offer of biotransference countless times, searching for alternatives that might have existed. He analyzed the rebellion against the star gods, calculating whether earlier action might have preserved more of his people. Most importantly, he considered what future might be possible for the Necrons upon their eventual awakening, whether redemption or restoration might yet be achievable for a species that had sacrificed its very soul. The war in Heaven's aftershocks continue to reverberate through the galaxy even in the 41st millennium, shaping conflicts and civilizations in ways that most of its inhabitants cannot comprehend. What began as a struggle between the Old Ones and the Necrontyr, escalated by the Khatan, and concluded with the Great Sleep, left an indelible mark on the very fabric of reality itself. Perhaps the most profound legacy of this ancient conflict is the fundamental alteration of the warp. Before the war in Heaven, the Immaterium existed as a relatively calm reflection of the material universe, a realm of potential and psychic energy, but lacking the predatory consciousness that now defines it. The unprecedented scale of death and suffering during the war created ripples in the warp that never truly subsided. Billions of sentient beings experiencing terror, pain, and despair imprinted these emotions onto the Immaterium, creating the first patterns that would eventually coalesce into the Chaos Gods. The transformation was gradual but irreversible, as the Old Ones created increasingly psychically attuned warrior races to combat the Necron threat. They inadvertently strengthened the connection between real space and the warp. The Eldar, with their extraordinary psychic potential, acted as conduits through which emotions and experiences flowed into the Immaterium with unprecedented intensity. The Krork's collective consciousness, while less refined, contributed massive amounts of aggressive energy that further disturbed the warp's nature. By the time the Necrons entered their Great Sleep, the warp had already begun its transformation from a neutral dimension into the turbulent, predatory realm recognized in the 41st millennium. The first proto-demons, formless entities of pure emotion, had emerged from the psychic residue of the war. These beings would eventually evolve into the complex demonic hierarchies that now serve the Chaos Gods, but their origins lie directly in the suffering generated during the war in Heaven. This turbulent warp made conventional interstellar travel increasingly hazardous for emerging species. Without the Old Ones' guidance or access to the damaged webway, younger races were forced to develop alternative methods of faster-than-light travel. Many early civilizations that arose after the war in Heaven were effectively trapped within their home systems, unable to establish interstellar empires due to the dangers of warp transit. Only when humanity eventually developed the Gellar field in the 18th millennium would relatively safe warp travel become possible again for a non-psychic species. The physical legacy of the war in heaven is equally significant, though often less recognized. Scattered throughout the galaxy are weapons and artifacts of terrifying power, remnants of technologies deployed by both the Necrons and the Old Ones. The Blackstone fortresses, originally called the Talismans of Vol in Eldar mythology, represent one of the most potent examples of this ancient weaponry. These massive star-shaped structures, capable of channeling energy directly from the warp, were originally created to combat the Catan and their Necron servants. In the 41st millennium, only a handful of these fortresses remain operational, their full capabilities barely understood by their current possessors. The fortress used by Abaddon the Despoiler during the Gothic War demonstrated a fraction of its potential when it was used to destroy the planet Savivan. Yet even this devastating display represented only a minor application of the weapon's true power. At full capacity, directed by operators who fully understood their function, the Blackstone fortresses were capable of extinguishing stars. Other Old One technologies survive in fragmented or degraded forms. The webway itself, though damaged and diminished, remains partially functional, used primarily by the Aeldari and their dark kin. What modern users of these ancient tunnels fail to appreciate is that the webway they access represents merely a shadow of its original extent. Before the war in heaven, the webway connected virtually every star system in the galaxy, allowing instantaneous travel without the risks of warp exposure. The current network, with its collapsed sections and demon-infested regions, is like a few surviving roads of what was once a galaxy-spanning superhighway system. Necron technology has proven more durable, owing to the self-repairing properties of necrodermis and the stasis preservation of the tomb worlds. Gauss weapons, capable of disintegrating matter at the molecular level, remain as deadly in the 41st millennium as they were 60 million years ago. Tesseract labyrinths, devices capable of imprisoning beings of immense power in dimensional pockets, continue to function according to their original specifications. Most concerning for the younger races are the celestial orrery, devices that can trigger supernovae at will, and the World Engine, a planet-sized weapon platform capable of destroying entire systems. The Catan shards represent perhaps the most dangerous technological legacy of the ancient conflict. When the Necrons rebelled against their star god masters, they found themselves unable to truly destroy these beings of pure energy. Instead, they shattered the Catan into fragments, each containing a portion of the original entity's power and consciousness. These shards were imprisoned in Tesseract labyrinths and secured in the deepest vaults of the tomb worlds. As the Necrons awaken in the 41st millennium, some of these vaults have been breached, either through internal malfunctions or external interference. The released Catan shards, though far less powerful than their original forms, remain among the most dangerous entities in the galaxy. The transcendent shard of the Nightbringer encountered on Damnos demonstrated the ability to manipulate matter and energy on a fundamental level, while the Dragon shard imprisoned on Mars has influenced human technological development for millennia through its subtle psychic emanations. Even more concerning are the unaccounted for Catan shards, fragments that escaped during the original rebellion or were released during the Great Sleep when tomb systems failed. These entities operate according to their own incomprehensible agendas, sometimes manipulating mortal civilizations into serving their needs, other times working to restore themselves by locating and absorbing other shards of their original being. The Imperium remains largely unaware of this threat, classifying encounters with Catan shards as manifestations of unknown Xenos species or warp phenomena. The biological legacy of the war in heaven is most evident in the continued existence of the warrior races created by the Old Ones. The Aeldari, though diminished from their original design and further reduced by the fall, remain one of the most psychically potent species in the galaxy. Their civilization retains fragmentary memories of the ancient conflict, preserved in myth cycles and allegorical performances that few Aeldari themselves fully understand. The Harlequins, keepers of the Black Library and performers of the mythic cycles, maintain the most complete record of the war in heaven within their encoded dances and performances. The Fall of the Dragon and the Imprisonment of the Jackal God performances directly reference the Necron rebellion against the Khatan, though presented through layers of symbolism that obscure the historical truth. Only the most senior Harlequin solitaires understand the full historical context of these performances. The orcs, degraded descendants of the mighty Krork, have lost almost all conscious connection to their origins. Their genetic memory, however, retains certain instinctive reactions. Orcs demonstrate an unusual agitation when encountering Necron forces, a response more pronounced than their typical enthusiasm for combat. Some Ordo Xenos inquisitors theorize that this represents a species' memory of their ancient purpose as anti-Necron weapons, though the orcs themselves would be incapable of articulating this connection. Other species created during the War in Heaven have survived in highly altered forms. The Jakaro, occasionally encountered by Imperial forces and prized by radical inquisitors for their technological abilities, are believed to be descendants of a maintenance species created to service Old One technology. The Aetrud, with their unusual relationship to entropy and time, may represent another degraded Old One creation, though their exact purpose in the ancient conflict remains unclear. The awakening of the Necron tomb worlds in the late 41st millennium represents the most direct continuation of the War in Heaven's legacy. After 60 million years of dormancy, the ancient android warriors are returning to a galaxy utterly transformed from the one they left. The exact trigger for this mass awakening remains debated among Imperial scholars, with theories ranging from pre-programmed chronological thresholds to external stimuli such as the Tyranid hive fleets or the expansion of the Cicatrix maledictum. Whatever the cause, the pattern of awakening has proven dangerously unpredictable. Some tomb worlds have activated exactly as designed, with command hierarchies intact and clear strategic objectives. The Sodek dynasty, led by Pharaon Emotuk the Stormlord, exemplifies this orderly restoration, methodically reclaiming territory according to ancient claim markers and establishing clear spheres of influence. Other dynasties, such as the Nihilak and Mefrit, have similarly maintained their coherence through the Great Sleep. Many tomb worlds, however, have awakened in states of severe dysfunction. Damage sustained during their long dormancy has corrupted command protocols, erased memory engrams, or degraded necrodermis bodies beyond full repair capability. These malfunctioning tombs produce Necrons ranging from mindless automatons that attack any living being they encounter to deranged lords pursuing incomprehensible objectives based on corrupted data. The tomb world of Haleth exemplifies this dysfunction. When finally awakening on schedule, its systems activated to find a portion of its defensive forces had been active for millions of years, developing their own culture and belief systems in isolation. These Hollow Ones, as they called themselves, had evolved ritualistic behaviors around maintaining the tomb systems, viewing the stasis chambers not as housing their masters, but as containing imprisoned entities that should never be released. The awakening of the tomb's true occupants led to an internal conflict that continues to this day, with newly awakened Necron lords fighting their own deranged guardian constructs for control of the facility. More disturbing are tomb worlds affected by the Flayer virus. This corruption, released when the Flayer Khatan was shattered, causes Necrons to develop an insatiable hunger for organic flesh, a horrific parody of their lost biological existence. Infected Necrons collect and wear the skin of their victims, decorating their necrodermis bodies with grisly trophies. As the virus spreads through contact, even previously stable tomb worlds can fall to this corruption if exposed to infected units. The strategic objectives of awakening Necron dynasties vary widely, reflecting both their original character and the specific experiences of their Great Sleep. The Sodek dynasty under Emotic pursues straightforward territorial reconquest, methodically claiming star systems according to ancient borders. The Nihilak focus on recovering lost artifacts and technologies, particularly those looted from their tombs during their dormancy. The Maynarch dynasty, always among the most aggressive, has emerged with an apparently genocidal agenda, seeking to eliminate all organic life within their claimed territories. Some dynasties have developed more unusual objectives. The Nephrek, altered by a stasis field malfunction that caused their necrodermis bodies to emit golden light, now pursue a quasi-religious goal of transcendence, seeking to convert their mechanical forms into pure energy. The Thoth dynasty, whose tomb world drifted through a radiation-saturated nebula during the Great Sleep, emerged with necrodermis bodies that glow with blue energy. They now seek to harness stellar phenomena to further enhance these unexpected modifications. Perhaps most significant for the galaxy's future is the return of Zarek, the Silent King, from his self-imposed exile in the intergalactic void. His return was prompted by contact with the Tyranid hive fleets approaching from beyond the galaxy, a threat he recognized as potentially existential even for the Necrons. After 60 million years of contemplation, the Silent King has returned with a new vision for his people, not merely the reconquest of their ancient territories, but the potential restoration of their biological forms. This ambition, considered impossible for most of Necron history, is based on technologies and concepts Zarek claims to have discovered during his exile. Whether such restoration is truly achievable remains uncertain, but the possibility has galvanized many dynasties to acknowledge the Silent King's authority once more. Others reject his leadership, seeing the pursuit of biological restoration as an admission of weakness or a betrayal of what they have become. As the 42nd millennium dawns, the legacy of the war in heaven stands at a crossroads. The awakening Necrons, the damaged webway, the Catan shards, and the corrupted warp all represent direct continuations of this ancient conflict. The younger races, humanity, the Aeldari remnants, even the orcs, move through a galaxy shaped by events they barely comprehend, fighting over the scraps of empires that rose and fell before their ancestors had even evolved. The ultimate legacy of the war in heaven may be the lesson it offers, one that none of the current galactic powers seem capable of learning. The old ones, the Necrontyr and the Catan, each pursued absolute dominance, each believed in their own supremacy, and each eventually fell. 60 million years later, the pattern repeats with new participants but similar stakes. Whether this cycle of conflict will ever be broken remains the greatest unanswered question in the blood-soaked history of the galaxy.